What if I told you that the most visited national park in America has been hiding 8 terrifying secrets for over 2 centuries? I'm talking about the Great Smoky Mountains, where the Cherokee once whispered warnings about places so cursed that even they refused to speak their names after dark. Look, I know most of you watching this haven't hit that subscribe button yet, and honestly, that breaks my heart, because I spend countless sleepless nights researching these stories just to bring you the truth that others are too afraid to share. Tonight, I'm risking everything to expose 8 documented cases of supernatural terror that park rangers don't want tourists to know about. These aren't just campfire stories. These are verified accounts of ancient curses, vengeful spirits, and creatures that have been claiming victims for generations. By the end of this video, you'll understand why the Cherokee called these mountains the Land of Blue Smoke. And trust me, it has nothing to do with the weather. If you've ever felt truly alone in the dark, if you've ever sensed something watching you from the shadows, then you need to stay with me through every single one of these tales, because what I'm about to reveal will change how you see America's most beloved wilderness forever. Tale 1. Spearfinger, the Cherokee Child. Slayer deep in the heart of Chilhowee Mountain, where the morning mist clings to ancient oaks like ghostly fingers, there once lived a creature so terrifying that Cherokee mothers would pull their children close at the mere mention of her name. They called her Utlanta, but you might know her by her English name, Spearfinger. Now, before you think this is just another campfire story, let me tell you something that will make your blood run cold. The Cherokee didn't create folklore for entertainment. Every legend, every story, every whispered warning served a purpose: to keep their people alive. And Spearfinger? She was the reason Cherokee children never wandered alone into the deep woods. Picture this. You're a Cherokee, child in the 1700s, maybe 7 or 8 years old, playing near your village when you hear your grandmother's voice calling from the forest edge. Her familiar, loving voice beckoning you to come closer, telling you she has something special to show you. You run toward the sound because why wouldn't you trust the woman who has sung you to sleep every night of your life? But as you get closer, something feels wrong. The voice is right, but the shadows seem too deep, too dark, and there's a sound, like stone scraping against stone, that makes your skin crawl. You stop, suddenly afraid, and that's when you see her stepping out from behind the trees. She looks exactly like your grandmother. Same weathered face, same kind eyes, same gentle smile that has comforted you through countless nightmares. But then she raises her right hand to beckon you closer, and your world turns to ice. Where her index finger should be, there's a spear, a long, sharp stone blade that gleams with something dark and wet. Her finger has been replaced by a weapon, and as she smiles wider, you notice her teeth are stained red, and there's something primitive and hungry in her eyes that was never there. In your real grandmother's gaze, you try to run but your legs won't move. This is Spearfinger's power. She can paralyze you with fear, lock your muscles in place while she approaches with that terrible scraping sound. Each step she takes sounds like stone grinding against stone because her skin isn't skin at all. It's rock, impenetrable and ancient, covering a creature that has been hunting in these mountains since before your people's grandparents were born. The Cherokee warriors discovered this the hard way when they tried to kill her with arrows and spears, only to watch their weapons shatter against her stone flesh like twigs against a mountain. But here's where the story gets truly horrifying. Spearfinger doesn't just kill, she feeds, and what she feeds on will make you sick. As she gets closer, still wearing your grandmother's face, still speaking in your grandmother's voice, she tells you how hungry she is, how long it's been since she's had a proper meal. She explains almost lovingly that she's going to use that Spearfinger to cut you open, and then she's going to reach inside and pull out your liver while you're still alive to watch, because that's what Spearfinger eats, the livers of children. And according to Cherokee tradition, she prefers them fresh and warm, torn from living bodies while the heart is still beating. The most terrifying part? She could be anyone. Your mother calling you in for dinner, your father asking you to help with chores, Your best friend suggesting you explore a new part of the forest. Spearfinger was the ultimate shapeshifter, able to perfectly mimic the appearance and voice of anyone you trusted. The only way to identify her was that Spearfinger, but by the time you were close enough to see it, it was already too late. Cherokee. Parents would teach their children to always look at people's hands, to never approach anyone whose right index finger they couldn't clearly see, but even knowing her secret didn't guarantee safety. There are accounts from Cherokee oral tradition of entire families being slaughtered because Spearfinger learned to hide her weapon. She would approach as a beloved relative, keep her right hand behind her back or tucked in her clothing, and only reveal the Spearfinger at the last moment. Children would realize the truth just seconds before that stone blade pierced their flesh, just long enough to understand that the person they trusted most in the world was actually their killer. The Cherokee tried everything to stop her. They set traps, organized hunting parties, even attempted to track her to her lair deep in the mountain caves. But Spearfinger was ancient and cunning. She would disappear for months, even years, making people think she was gone forever. Then, just when the villages started to relax, just when parents began letting their children play outside again, she would return. Always during the times when families were most vulnerable. During harvest season, when adults were busy in the fields. During winter months, when the long nights provided perfect cover for her hunts. The truly chilling part is how she would study her victims. Cherokee elders speak of children who reported seeing their relatives acting strangely in the days before Spearfinger struck. A grandmother who stood too still for too long. A mother whose smile never quite reached her eyes. An uncle who forgot. Simple family stories that he should have known by heart. These weren't the real relatives. They were Spearfinger learning to perfect her disguise, studying the family dynamics, understanding exactly how to gain each child's trust. And when she finally struck, it wasn't quick. The Cherokee say that Spearfinger savored the fear, that she would reveal her true nature slowly, letting the child understand what was about to happen. She would transform gradually. The familiar face would begin to shift. The skin would turn gray and hard like stone, and that terrible Spearfinger would emerge from hiding. But the worst part was her voice. Even as her appearance changed, she would keep speaking in the voice of the person she was impersonating, creating a horrifying disconnect between the monster you were seeing and the loved one you were hearing. Some say the Cherokee finally defeated Spearfinger by discovering her one weakness. Her heart was in her right hand, the same hand that bore the Spearfinger. Warriors managed to strike her there during a battle, and she crumbled to dust like an ancient stone finally worn away by time. But others whisper that she wasn't destroyed, just wounded, and that she retreated deep into Chilhowie Mountain to heal and wait. Here's what should terrify you. The Cherokee believe Spearfinger is still out there. They say she's learned to adapt, to modernize her hunting methods. In the early 1900s, there were reports of children disappearing near Chilhowie Mountain, their bodies found days later with precise surgical wounds where their livers had been removed. Park rangers dismissed these as animal attacks, but the Cherokee elders knew better. They recognized the signature of Spearfinger, the careful, almost surgical precision of the cuts, the way only the liver was taken, the fact that the children were found in places that would have been impossible for any normal predator to reach. And in recent years? Well, let me ask you this. How many times have you gotten a text from a family member asking you to meet them somewhere, only to show up and find out they never sent that message? How many times have you heard your name being called in the woods, turned around, and found nobody there? The Cherokee say Spearfinger has learned to use our technology against us, that she can mimic our voices through phones, send false messages, even appear in our video calls. After all, if you can shapeshift, why not adapt to the digital age? So the next time you're hiking in the Smokies and you hear a familiar voice calling from the tree line, look carefully at their hands before you answer. Because in these ancient mountains where the mist hides secrets older than civilization, Spearfinger is still hunting. And she's still hungry. Tale 2. The Wampus Cat Curse, the woman who broke the sacred law. In the deepest hollows of the Great Smoky Mountains, where the ancient Cherokee once held their most sacred ceremonies, There prowls a creature that embodies one of humanity's darkest truths. Curiosity can damn your soul forever. The Cherokee called her Iwa, but European settlers would later know her as the Wampus Cat. What makes this story truly terrifying isn't just the monster itself, it's how she was created, because the Wampus Cat was once human, once a woman whose only crime was wanting to know what the men were hiding. Her name was Atsila, and she lived in a Cherokee village nestled in what is now the heart of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. This was centuries ago, when the forests were darker, deeper, and filled with mysteries that modern minds can barely comprehend. Atsila was known throughout her village as a woman of fierce intelligence and boundless curiosity. While other women were content with their traditional roles, Atsila always wondered what lay beyond the boundaries set for her. She questioned everything: why certain areas of the forest were forbidden to women, why the men held secret ceremonies that no female eyes were allowed to witness, why there were laws that seemed designed to keep her from understanding the full truth of her world. The Cherokee had strict sacred laws about their spiritual ceremonies, particularly the war rituals and hunting magic performed by the men of the tribe. These weren't just traditions, they were cosmic boundaries that kept the balance between the physical and spiritual worlds. Women had their own powerful ceremonies, their own sacred knowledge, but the male rituals were forbidden territory. The tribal elders taught that mixing the energies, allowing the wrong eyes to witness the wrong ceremonies, could tear holes in the fabric of reality itself. But Atsila didn't believe in boundaries. She believed that knowledge belonged to anyone brave enough to seek it. The night that changed everything started like any other autumn evening. The men of the village had gathered for a sacred hunting ceremony, one of the most powerful and dangerous rituals in Cherokee tradition. This wasn't just about asking the spirits for successful hunts. This was about communing with the ancient powers that controlled life and death, the primal forces that govern predator and prey. The ceremony would call upon spirits so old and wild that they existed before humans learned to speak, entities that understood only the raw language of fang and claw. The very air around the ceremony would become charged with predatory energy, transforming the participants into spiritual hunters capable of tracking not just animals, but souls themselves. Atsila knew about the ceremony, and she burned with the need to understand it. What secrets were the men learning? What power were they accessing that was deemed too dangerous for women to witness? As darkness fell, and the men disappeared into the sacred grove deep in the forest, Atsila made a decision that would damn her for eternity. She would follow them. She would hide in the shadows and finally learn the truth that had been kept from her all her life. The sacred grove was a place where the trees grew in perfect circles, where the very earth seemed to pulse with ancient power. The Cherokee believed this was a thin place where the spirit world pressed close against the physical realm. As Atsila crept through the underbrush, she could feel the wrongness of her presence. The forest itself seemed to recoil from her. The animals fell silent, and even the wind stopped blowing. But her curiosity was stronger than her fear, and she pressed on until she found the perfect hiding spot behind a massive oak that had stood sentinel in these woods for over 1,000 years. What she saw when the ceremony began defied every understanding she had of reality. The men of her village stood in a circle around a fire that burned without wood, flames that danced in colors that had no names. They wore masks carved from materials that seemed to shift and writhe in the firelight, and as they began to chant, their voices harmonized with sounds that came from no human throat. The very air began to thicken, and Atsila watched in horror and fascination as shadows began to move independently of the bodies that cast them. But then, the real transformation began. One by one, the men started to change, not their bodies, their souls. Atsila could see, with vision that had been heightened by the magical energy saturating the grove, as each man's spiritual essence took on the form of their hunting animal. She watched her own brother become a wolf in spirit, saw her uncle transform into a great bear, witnessed the village chief's soul manifest as a massive mountain lion. They were becoming one with the predator spirits, gaining the ability to hunt, not just in the physical world but in the realm of dreams and nightmares. And that's when everything went wrong. The ancient spirits conducting the ceremony suddenly sensed her presence. These weren't benevolent entities. They were primal forces of nature that existed long before concepts like mercy or forgiveness. To them, Atzila's presence was a violation, so profound it was like a scream in a sacred silence. The very foundations of cosmic law had been broken, and punishment was not just inevitable, it was automatic. The spirits turned their attention toward her hiding place, and Atzila felt their gaze like ice in her veins. She tried to run, but her legs wouldn't obey her. She tried to scream, but no sound would come. The last thing she remembered as a human was the sensation of falling, not through space, but through reality itself, tumbling through layers of existence, until she landed somewhere that was neither fully physical nor completely spiritual. When Atzila awoke, she knew immediately that something was catastrophically wrong. She tried to stand, but her body moved differently. She looked down at her hands and saw paws, massive clawed paws that belonged to no earthly creature. Her reflection in a nearby stream showed her the horrible truth. She had been transformed into something that was neither human nor animal, but a nightmare fusion of both. She stood upright like a woman but possessed the body of an enormous wildcat. Her face was still recognizably hers, but stretched and distorted, with fangs that jutted from her mouth and eyes that glowed with an unholy light. But the physical transformation was nothing compared to the curse that had been placed upon her mind. Atzila retained all of her human intelligence, all of her memories, all of her emotions, but layered over them was an insatiable hunger for violence and a compulsion to hunt that she could never control. She was trapped in a predator's body with a human's conscience, forced to watch herself commit acts of savagery while being powerless to stop them. The spirits had crafted the perfect punishment: eternal awareness of what she had lost and what she had become. The worst part was the loneliness. Atzila could never return to her village, never speak to another human being, never explain what had happened or why. She was doomed to wander the mountains forever, caught between two worlds and belonging to neither. During the day, she would hide in the deepest caves, wrestling with her human memories and the growing animal instincts that threatened to consume what remained of her humanity. But at night, when the hunting compulsion became too strong to resist, she would prowl the forest, her 6 legs carrying her faster than any natural creature, searching for prey to satisfy a hunger that could never be filled. The Cherokee began to hear her before they saw her. Her cry was unlike anything in nature, part human sob, part feline yowl, a sound so heartbreaking and terrifying that it would freeze the blood of anyone who heard it. Hunters would report finding tracks that made no sense, paw prints that were too large, too deep, arranged in a pattern that suggested something walking upright. Livestock began disappearing from the villages, not eaten, but killed, with a precision that spoke of intelligence behind the slaughter. And then the sightings began. Travelers would report seeing a massive cat-like creature standing upright at the edge of the forest, watching them with eyes that held too much intelligence, too much pain. Some claimed they could see the ghost of a woman's face in the creature's features, a human soul trapped behind animal eyes. The bravest hunters tried to track her, but the Wampus Cat seemed to exist partially outside of normal reality. She could disappear into shadows that weren't deep enough to hide anything, leap distances that defied physics, and move through the forest without disturbing a single leaf. As decades passed, Atzila's human memories began to fade, but they never disappeared completely. She would have moments of clarity where she remembered her life as a woman, and in those moments her anguish was so complete that her cries could be heard for miles. Cherokee mothers would recognize the sound and pull their children inside, knowing that the Wampus Cat was remembering what she had lost. These were the most dangerous times because Atzila's grief would drive her to seek out human contact, to try to return to the world she could never again be part of. There are accounts from the early settlers of the region about a massive cat-like creature that would approach their cabins at night, standing just at the edge of the firelight. The creature would make sounds that were almost like speech, as if it were trying to communicate, trying to explain itself. But whenever someone approached, the creature would flee, leaving behind only massive paw prints and the lingering sense that they had encountered something tragic beyond measure. The Cherokee elders say that Atzila's punishment was designed to serve as a warning for all future generations. They teach that curiosity without wisdom is one of the most dangerous traits a human can possess, that some knowledge comes with a price too terrible to pay. The story of the Wampus Cat became a cautionary tale told to young Cherokee women who showed too much interest in forbidden knowledge, a reminder that some boundaries exist for reasons more important than satisfying curiosity. But here's what makes this story truly terrifying for modern audiences. The Cherokee believe the Wampus Cat is still out there. Park rangers in the Great Smoky Mountains receive reports every year of hikers who hear unexplainable sounds in the night, part human, part animal, filled with a sadness so profound it seems to echo from the very mountains themselves. Campers report seeing a large, upright figure watching them from the tree line, something that vanishes the moment they try to get a closer look. In recent decades, there have been increasingly disturbing accounts from visitors to the Smokies. Hikers have reported finding livestock killed with surgical precision miles from any farm, their bodies arranged in patterns that suggest intelligence behind the slaughter. Night photographers have captured images of something moving through the forest, too large to be a normal wildcat, too fast to be human, but somehow combining elements of both. Most terrifying of all are the audio recordings. Park visitors have captured sounds on their phones that wildlife experts can't identify, cries that seem to contain human words mixed with animal vocalizations. The Cherokee warn that the Wampus Cat is drawn to those who share Atzila's fatal flaw, an insatiable curiosity about things that should remain hidden. They say she recognizes kindred spirits, people who push boundaries and refuse to accept that some knowledge is forbidden. If you're the type of person who explores abandoned buildings, who seeks out dangerous urban legends, who can't resist investigating strange sounds in the night, then you're exactly the kind of person who might catch her attention. So the next time you're camping in the Smokies and you hear something moving through the forest that doesn't sound quite like any animal, remember Atzila's story. Remember that some curses are born from the very human desire to know more than we should. And if you see glowing eyes watching you from the darkness, eyes that seem to hold far too much intelligence and far too much pain, don't try to investigate. Don't let your curiosity draw you closer. Because in these ancient mountains, the price of forbidden knowledge is still being paid every single night by a woman who learned too late that some secrets are kept hidden for a reason. The Wampus Cat is still hunting, still crying, still trapped between worlds. And she's always looking for someone who might understand the terrible weight of knowing too much. Tale 3. Lucy of Roaring Fork, the barefoot phantom who still rides tonight. On a bone-chilling November night in 1900, when the first frost had turned the leaves of the Great Smoky Mountains into a tapestry of death, a man named Foster Williamson was making his way home through the winding forest paths near what is now the Roaring Fork Motor Nature Trail. Foster was a practical man, a blacksmith by trade who didn't believe in ghost stories or mountain superstitions. He trusted in things he could hammer into shape with his own two hands, things that made sense in the daylight world of iron and fire. But what happened to him that night would shatter his rational worldview so completely that he would spend the rest of his life as a broken, haunted shell of the man he once was. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and Foster's breath formed clouds in the frigid air as his horse picked its way carefully along the treacherous mountain path. The only sounds were the rhythmic clip-clop of hooves on frozen ground and the distant roar of Roaring Fork Creek, swollen with autumn rains and early snowmelt. Foster was eager to get home to his warm cabin and his waiting wife, but he was also an experienced mountain traveler who knew better than to push his horse too hard on the icy trails. One wrong step could send them both tumbling into the rocky ravines that bordered the narrow path. It was just past midnight when Foster first saw her. At first, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. Perhaps it was just a deer caught in the pale moonlight, or maybe a trick of shadows cast by the bare branches overhead. But as he drew closer, the shape resolved into something that made his blood run cold. There, walking along the side of the treacherous mountain road in the bitter November cold, was a young woman. She was beautiful beyond description, with long, dark hair that seemed to float around her shoulders like water and skin so pale it seemed to glow in the moonlight. But what stopped Foster's heart was what she wasn't wearing. No coat, no shoes, nothing to protect her from the killing cold that had already begun to form ice crystals on his horse's mane. Foster pulled his horse to a stop and called out to her, his voice echoing strangely in the thin mountain air. Miss, are you all right? You'll freeze to death out here." The woman turned toward him, and Foster felt his breath catch in his throat. Her face was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, with features so perfect they seemed carved by angels. But her eyes held a sadness so deep and profound that Foster felt tears spring to his own eyes just looking at her. She smiled at him, a smile that was both heartbreaking and enchanting, and when she spoke, her voice was like music made from moonlight and sorrow. "I seem to have lost my way," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the cold air, despite speaking barely above a whisper. "I'm trying to get home, but the paths all look the same in the darkness." Foster noticed that her feet were bare against the frozen ground, but she showed no signs of discomfort, no shivering or chattering teeth, despite the fact that her breath should have been visible in the frigid air. Something deep in his mind tried to warn him that this was wrong, that no human could survive barefoot in this weather, but the woman's beauty and obvious distress overwhelmed his rational thoughts. "Please," Foster heard himself saying, his voice sounding strange and distant to his own ears, "let me give you a ride. You'll die of exposure if you stay out here." The woman's smile grew brighter, and she approached his horse with a grace that seemed to defy the rough terrain. "You're very kind," she said as she accepted his hand and climbed up behind him on the horse. "My name is Lucy." As she settled herself behind him, Foster felt her arms wrap around his waist, and despite the freezing temperature, her touch seemed to warm him from the inside out. As they rode through the night, Lucy pressed close against Foster's back, and he found himself falling deeper and deeper under her spell. She spoke to him in that musical voice about the beauty of the mountains, about the way the moonlight painted the frost-covered trees silver, about the peace that could only be found in these ancient hills. Her words seemed to weave themselves into his very soul, and Foster found himself sharing things he had never told another living person, his fears, his dreams, his secret longing for something more meaningful than the endless cycle of heating iron and hammering metal that defined his days. The journey that should have taken 30 minutes stretched into hours, but Foster didn't mind. He had never felt so alive, so connected to another human being. Lucy's presence seemed to make the entire world more vivid, more real. Colors appeared brighter, sounds carried deeper meaning, and even the cold night air seemed to sing with hidden music. When Lucy laughed at something he said, the sound was like silver bells ringing across a crystal lake, and Foster knew with absolute certainty that he was falling in love with this mysterious woman who had appeared to him like a vision from a dream. As dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Lucy directed him to a small cabin nestled in a grove of ancient oak trees near the headwaters of Roaring Fork Creek. The cabin was modest but well-maintained, with smoke rising from the chimney and warm yellow light glowing in the windows. "This is my home," Lucy said, as Foster helped her down from the horse. Her feet touched the ground without making a sound, and Foster noticed that despite their long ride through the muddy forest paths, there wasn't a speck of dirt on her dress or a single mark on her bare feet. Lucy turned to face him, and in the growing light of dawn, Foster could see that her beauty was even more extraordinary than he had realized. Her skin seemed to have an inner light, and her eyes held depths that spoke of wisdom far beyond her apparent years. "Thank you for your kindness," she said, reaching up to touch his cheek with fingers that felt like silk and cool water. "I won't forget what you've done for me tonight." As she turned to walk toward the cabin, Foster felt a desperation rise in his chest. He couldn't let her go, couldn't let this magical night end. "Lucy," he called out, his voice cracking with emotion. "Will I see you again?" She paused in the doorway and looked back at him, that heartbreaking smile playing across her lips. "Perhaps," she said. "But be careful what you wish for, Foster Williamson. Some meetings are meant to happen, only once." Then she disappeared into the cabin, leaving Foster alone with his horse and a heart that felt like it might burst from the intensity of his feelings. Foster rode home in a daze, his mind replaying every moment of the night, every word Lucy had spoken, every touch of her hand. By the time he reached his own cabin, he had made a decision that would destroy his life. He was going to marry Lucy, no matter what it took. He would go to her father, declare his intentions, and make her his wife. The fact that he was already married, that he had a wife waiting for him at home, seemed like a distant and unimportant detail compared to the overwhelming love he felt for the mysterious woman of the mountains. Foster barely slept that day. He went through the motions of his daily routine, but his mind was entirely focused on Lucy. He planned what he would say to her father, imagined the life they would build together, dreamed of the children they would have and the happiness they would share. As soon as the sun began to set, he saddled his horse and rode back toward the cabin where he had left her, his heart pounding with anticipation and nervous excitement. But when Foster reached the grove of oak trees where Lucy's cabin had stood, he found nothing but empty forest. There was no cabin, no chimney smoke, no warm yellow light. There wasn't even a clearing where a cabin could have stood. The trees grew thick and undisturbed, their massive trunks showing no signs of recent disturbance. Foster searched frantically, thinking he had somehow taken a wrong turn, but every landmark was exactly where it should be. The creek was in the right place, the distinctive rock formation was unchanged, even the lightning-struck pine tree he had used as a marker was exactly where he remembered it. Desperate and confused, Foster rode to the nearest neighbor's cabin, an old mountain family named the Oglesbys, who had lived in these hills for 3 generations. "I'm looking for a young woman named Lucy," he told them, describing the cabin and its location. "She lives near the headwaters of Roaring Fork Creek." The Oglesbys exchanged glances, and Foster saw something flicker in their eyes, recognition, mixed with fear and pity. "Son," Old Man Oglesby said slowly, "there ain't been nobody living up that way for nigh on 15 years. Not since the cabin fire." Foster felt his world tilt on its axis. "Cabin fire? What cabin fire?" Mrs. Oglesby took her husband's arm, her knuckles white with the strength of her grip. "Lucy Henderson's cabin," she whispered. "Sweet girl, lived up there with her folks until she was about 20. There was a fire one winter night, must have been 1885 or so. Started when a log rolled out of the fireplace while the family was sleeping. Lucy's parents made it out, but Lucy—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "But Lucy what?" Foster demanded, though part of him already knew the answer and was screaming at him not to ask. Old Man Oglesby met his eyes with a look of profound sadness. "Lucy burned to death in that fire, son. They found her body the next morning, burned, so bad they could barely recognize her. But here's the strange part. She was found in the doorway, like she was trying to get out. Only she wasn't wearing any shoes, and her feet—" He paused, swallowing hard. "Her feet were burned clean off. She died trying to escape that fire, running barefoot through the flames." Foster felt the world spinning around him, his vision tunneling as the implications crashed over him like a mountain avalanche. "That's impossible," he whispered. "I spoke with her. I touched her. She was real." But even as he said the words, pieces began falling into place. Lucy's bare feet that never got dirty, her breath that didn't mist in the freezing air, the way she had seemed to float rather than walk, the cabin that appeared and disappeared like smoke. Mrs. Oglesby reached out and touched Foster's arm with gentle sympathy. "You ain't the first to see her, son. Lucy's been walking these roads ever since the fire, looking for someone to take her home. Some say she don't know she's dead, that she's still trying to escape that burning cabin. Others think she's trapped here, doomed to wander until she finds peace." She paused, studying Foster's stricken face. "But you're the first one to say she spoke to you, the first one to claim she rode with them. That's never happened before. Foster rode home that night in a state of shock so complete that he could barely function. He had fallen in love with a ghost, had shared the most intimate moments of his life with a woman who had been dead for 15 years. But what haunted him most wasn't the supernatural nature of his encounter. It was the memory of Lucy's sadness, the profound grief he had seen in her eyes. She wasn't just a ghost wandering aimlessly through the mountains. She was a soul in torment, trapped by the traumatic circumstances of her death, endlessly reliving her final moments of terror and pain. As weeks passed, Foster found himself unable to eat, unable to sleep, unable to focus on anything but his memories of that impossible night. His wife begged him to tell her what was wrong, but how could he explain that he had fallen in love with a dead woman? How could he describe the way Lucy's touch had made him feel more alive than he had ever felt before, while knowing that her touch was the caress of death itself? Foster began riding the mountain roads every night, hoping to see Lucy again, desperate to understand what had happened and why he had been chosen for such an encounter. Sometimes he thought he glimpsed her, in his peripheral vision, a pale figure walking along the roadside, but when he turned to look directly, there was nothing there. Other times he heard her voice carried on the mountain wind, calling his name with that same musical quality that had enchanted him, but the sound would fade before he could determine its source. The obsession consumed Foster completely. He stopped working, stopped eating regularly, stopped maintaining any semblance of normal life. His wife finally left him, unable to compete with the memory of a dead woman for her husband's affections. Friends and neighbors began to whisper that Foster had lost his mind, that something had broken inside him during his night rides through the mountains. But Foster knew he wasn't crazy. Lucy was real, their connection was real, and somehow, for reasons he couldn't understand, the boundary between life and death had been temporarily lifted to allow them to meet. Years passed, and Foster aged rapidly, under the weight of his obsession. His hair turned white, his face became gaunt and haunted, and his eyes took on the wild look of a man who had seen too much. He spent every night riding the mountain roads, searching for Lucy, calling her name into the darkness. Sometimes other travelers would report seeing him, a wild-looking man on horseback, shouting at empty air, pleading with shadows that no one else could see. Foster died in 1923, found frozen to death beside his horse on the very stretch of road where he had first encountered Lucy. The horse was unharmed, but Foster's body showed signs of a strange and peaceful death, as if he had simply laid down in the snow and chosen not to get back up. Those who found him said he had a smile on his face, the first smile anyone had seen from him in over 20 years. But here's where the story takes its most terrifying turn. Foster's death didn't end the encounters with Lucy. It intensified them. Park rangers and visitors to the Great Smoky Mountains began reporting sightings of not one, but two figures walking along the Roaring Fork area. A beautiful young woman in a white dress, barefoot and glowing in the moonlight, accompanied by a tall man who matched Foster's description. They were always seen together, always walking hand in hand, always appearing to travelers who were alone on the mountain roads at night. The encounters follow a pattern that has remained consistent for over a century. A lone traveler, usually someone driving or hiking late at night, will spot two figures on the side of the road. The woman appears to be in distress, and her companion seems to be trying to help her. Good Samaritans who stop to offer assistance report that the couple approaches their vehicle, with the woman climbing into the back seat while the man remains outside. The woman, who always introduces herself as Lucy, will give directions to a location near Roaring Fork Creek, engaging the driver in conversation during the journey. But here's what makes these modern encounters truly terrifying. Lucy no longer travels alone. Foster's spirit has joined her eternal wandering, but his presence has changed the nature of the haunting. While Lucy was once merely a lost soul seeking help, the addition of Foster has created something far more dangerous. Witnesses report that Foster's spirit seems possessive, jealous of anyone who shows kindness to Lucy. Men who offer to help are subjected to increasingly aggressive behavior from Foster's ghost, including unexplained mechanical failures in their vehicles, sudden drops in temperature, and an overwhelming sense of rage and jealousy that can drive normally rational people to dangerous extremes. Women who encounter the pair face a different kind of horror. Lucy, perhaps driven by jealousy over Foster's obsessive love, has become increasingly hostile toward other women. Female drivers report that Lucy's beautiful face transforms during the journey, becoming twisted with rage and envy. Her musical voice turns harsh and threatening, and she begins making accusations, claiming that the driver is trying to steal Foster's attention, threatening terrible retribution for imagined slights. The modern reports are consistent in their descriptions of how these encounters end. As the vehicle approaches the area where Lucy's cabin once stood, both spirits begin to change. Their forms become more transparent, their voices develop an echoing quality, and the temperature inside the vehicle drops dramatically. Lucy's directions become increasingly frantic and confused, as if she's reliving the disorientation of her final moments. Foster's presence becomes oppressive, filling the car with an overwhelming sense of jealousy and possessive rage. Then, just as suddenly as they appeared, both spirits vanish, leaving the driver alone on a dark mountain road with no memory of exactly how they got there. Vehicles are often found with unexplained damage, scratches that look like fingernails on the interior, windows that have fogged over despite clear weather, and a lingering smell of smoke that no amount of cleaning can remove. But the most disturbing aspect of these modern encounters is what happens to the people who experience them. Like Foster before them, many become obsessed with returning to the mountains, with finding Lucy and Foster again. They describe feeling an overwhelming compulsion to drive the mountain roads at night, to search for the pale figures who seem to promise answers to questions they didn't know they had. Some abandon their normal lives entirely, spending every night driving through the Smokies, calling out to spirits who may or may not answer. Park rangers have documented dozens of cases of visitors who claim to have given rides to Lucy and Foster, and the psychological impact on these individuals is profound and lasting. Many report nightmares filled with fire and smoke, dreams where they are trapped in burning buildings with no escape. Others become fixated on the idea of death as a romantic reunion, developing dangerous ideations about joining Lucy and Foster in their eternal wandering. The Cherokee elders who still live in the region offer a different perspective on Lucy's haunting. They believe that Lucy's spirit became trapped not just by the trauma of her death, but by Foster's obsessive love. In Cherokee tradition, the intensity of Foster's feelings created a spiritual bond that survived death. But that bond has become corrupted over time. What began as love has transformed into possession, and Lucy is no longer wandering in search of peace. She's trapped in an eternal cycle of Foster's jealousy and need. According to Cherokee spiritual beliefs, Foster's spirit should have moved on after death, but his obsession with Lucy kept him tethered to the physical world. His presence has corrupted Lucy's haunting, transforming her from a lost soul seeking help into something far more dangerous. The elders warn that the pair feeds off the emotional energy of living people, particularly the feelings of love, loneliness, and romantic longing that draw people to stop and help them. So the next time you find yourself driving alone through the Great Smoky Mountains late at night, and you see two figures on the side of the road, a beautiful woman in white and a tall man who seems to be helping her, remember Foster's story. Remember that some love stories don't end with death. They become twisted by it. And if you feel compelled to stop, if something deep inside you insists that you must help these lost souls, ask yourself this: are you prepared to become part of a story that has been playing out for over a century, a tragic cycle of obsession and possession that has already claimed more victims than you might imagine? Lucy is still walking these mountain roads, still barefoot in the eternal cold. But she's no longer alone, and she's no longer simply lost. She's become something far more dangerous, a ghost powered by the corrupted love of a man who couldn't let her go, even in death. And every night she's looking for someone new to share her endless, tortured journey through the darkness of the Smoky Mountains. Tale 4. The Cussing Cover. Death by Lightning quilt. In the shadow-draped valley of Cades Cove, where morning mist clings to weathered cabins like the breath of the dead, there once lived a couple whose love story would become one of the most terrifying cautionary tales in all of Appalachian folklore. This is the story of Basil and Mavis Estep, and a handmade quilt that would become an instrument of supernatural vengeance so powerful that locals still refuse to speak its name after dark. What makes this tale particularly chilling is that every word of it is documented, every detail verified by witnesses who lived to tell about it, though some would argue that living through what they witnessed was the cruelest fate of all. Basil and Mavis Estep settled in Cades Cove in 1887, long before the creation of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, when this isolated valley was home to a tight-knit community of mountain folk who lived by their own laws and ancient superstitions. Their cabin was a modest two-room structure, built from chestnut logs that Basil had cut himself, chinked with red clay from the valley floor, and roofed with hand-split oak shingles. It wasn't much to look at from the outside, but inside Mavis had created a warm and loving home filled with her handmade quilts, each one a masterpiece of color and craftsmanship that told the story of their life together. Mavis was born during the most violent thunderstorm in living memory, on a night when lightning struck the valley 17 times and thunder shook the very foundations of the earth. Her mother always said that Mavis came into the world screaming with the voice of the storm itself, and from her earliest days she displayed an unnatural terror of lightning that went far beyond normal childhood fear. As she grew older, this fear evolved into an all-consuming phobia that dominated every aspect of her life. Mavis became convinced, with uncertainty that chilled everyone who knew her, that she was destined to die by lightning strike. This wasn't merely superstition or anxiety. Mavis possessed an almost supernatural ability to sense approaching storms hours before they arrived. She would become agitated and restless when the barometric pressure began to drop, pacing their small cabin like a caged animal as she felt the electrical charge building in the atmosphere. During thunderstorms, she would retreat to the center of their cabin as far as possible from windows and walls, and curl into a ball on the floor, shaking uncontrollably as each flash of lightning illuminated the world outside. But most significantly for our story, Mavis absolutely refused to allow any metal objects in their bedroom, convinced that metal would attract the lightning that she knew was coming for her. This meant that Basil and Mavis slept on a simple wooden bed frame that Basil had built with his own hands, held together with wooden pegs and rawhide strips instead of metal nails or bolts. The bed was sturdy enough, but it represented something deeper, Mavis's desperate attempt to control the uncontrollable, to somehow cheat the fate that she believed had been written in the stars the night she was born. Basil, who loved his wife more than life itself, never questioned her fears or tried to convince her that they were irrational. He simply adapted their lives to accommodate her terror, creating a metal-free sanctuary where Mavis could find some small measure of peace. It was in this metal-free bedroom that Mavis spent countless hours working on her quilts, creating works of art that were renowned throughout Cades Cove and beyond. Each quilt was unique, but they all shared certain characteristics that made them unmistakably Mavis's work. Intricate geometric patterns that seemed to shift and dance in changing light, color combinations that should have clashed, but somehow created perfect harmony, and stitching so fine and precise that it looked almost machine-made despite being entirely hand-sewn. But there was one quilt that stood apart from all the others, a creation so beautiful and perfect that it seemed to possess an almost supernatural power. Mavis called it her masterpiece, though she never gave it a formal name during her lifetime. It was larger than her other quilts, big enough to cover their wooden bed with fabric to spare, and its pattern was unlike anything she had ever attempted before. The design centered around a brilliant red flannel square that seemed to glow with its own inner light, surrounded by concentric circles of fabric in shades of blue, green, and gold that spiraled outward like ripples on a pond. The stitching was so intricate that looking at it for too long could make you dizzy, as if the pattern was somehow moving, drawing your eye inexorably toward that blazing red center. Mavis worked on this quilt for over 2 years, stitching by candlelight during the long winter evenings and by window light during the shorter days. She approached the work with an almost religious devotion, often becoming so absorbed in her stitching that she would forget to eat or sleep. Basil would find her bent over the quilt at all hours of the night, her fingers moving with supernatural speed and precision, adding layer upon layer of detail to what was already a work of incredible complexity. When neighbors asked about the quilt, Mavis would only say that it was protection against the storm, though she never explained exactly what she meant by that cryptic phrase. The quilt was completed in the spring of 1902, and from the moment Mavis laid it across their wooden bed, strange things began happening in the Estep cabin. The first sign was the way animals reacted to it. Dogs would refuse to enter the bedroom. Cats would arch their backs and hiss when they came near the quilt, and even the mice that plagued most mountain cabins seemed to avoid that room entirely. More disturbing were the electrical phenomena that began occurring around the quilt. Metal objects brought near it would develop a subtle charge, causing small sparks to jump between fingers and doorknobs. On humid days, the red flannel square in the center would seem to shimmer with static electricity, and more than once, Basil swore he could hear a faint humming sound coming from the fabric, like the sound of power lines in a thunderstorm. But the most unsettling effect was on Mavis herself. After sleeping under her masterpiece quilt for several weeks, she began to change in ways that disturbed everyone who knew her. Her lifelong terror of lightning began to fade, replaced by something that was almost like anticipation. She would stand at the windows during thunderstorms, no longer cowering in fear, but watching the lightning with an expression that Basil found deeply troubling. She began talking about the storm that was coming for her not as something to be feared, but as something she was preparing for, something she was ready to meet on her own terms. Tragically, Mavis's preparations would prove to be insufficient. In the fall of 1903, she contracted a wasting illness that no mountain remedy could cure. As she lay dying in their wooden bed under her masterpiece quilt, Mavis made Basil promise two things that would seal both their fates. First, he must never sell any of her quilts. They were to remain in the family forever, tokens of their love that would outlast death itself. Second, and most importantly, he must never, under any circumstances, place any of her quilts on a metal bed. The intensity of her final request was frightening to witness. Even as death claimed her, Mavis gripped Basil's hand with surprising strength and made him swear on their love that he would honor these wishes. Basil was devastated by Mavis's death, but he was also a practical man who understood that life must go on. After a period of mourning that lasted through the harsh winter of 1903-1904, he began to consider the possibility of remarriage. He was still a relatively young man, and the isolated life of a mountain bachelor was both lonely and difficult. When Truly Jane Lawson, a widow from Gatlinburg who was 20 years younger than Basil, began showing interest in him, he found himself drawn to the possibility of building a new life with someone who could help him heal from his grief. Truly Jane was everything that Mavis had not been: young, vivacious, and completely untroubled by superstitions or fears. She laughed at mountain folklore, dismissed talk of supernatural phenomena as ignorant nonsense, and made it clear that she intended to modernize Basil's primitive cabin if she were to become his wife. When Basil proposed in the spring of 1904, barely 6 months after Mavis's death, Truly Jane accepted on the condition that they completely redecorate the cabin to suit her more sophisticated tastes. The first change Truly Jane insisted on was replacing Basil's handmade wooden bed with a proper metal bed frame that she ordered from a catalog company in Knoxville. The new bed was a thing of beauty, solid iron painted with white enamel, with decorative brass fittings and a headboard that featured intricate scrollwork. It was exactly the kind of modern convenience that Truly Jane associated with civilized living, and she was puzzled by Basil's obvious reluctance to get rid of the old wooden bed that had been his marriage bed with Mavis. Basil found himself in an impossible position. He had promised Mavis that her quilts would never touch metal, but he also knew that refusing Truly Jane's reasonable request for a proper bed would strain their new marriage before it had even begun. He tried to compromise by storing Mavis's quilts away in a trunk, telling Truly Jane that they had sentimental value and he wasn't ready to use them yet. For several months, this arrangement worked well enough. They slept on the new metal bed with quilts that Truly Jane had brought from her own home, and Mavis's masterpiece remained safely tucked away with her other creations. But mountain winters are long and cold, and by December of 1904, even Truly Jane's thick quilts weren't enough to keep them warm in the drafty cabin. On a particularly bitter night when the wind howled through Cade's Cove like the voices of the restless dead, Truly Jane shivered under their blankets and made what seemed like a perfectly reasonable request. "Basil," she said, "I know those quilts of your first wife's have sentimental value, but it's foolish to let them sit unused when we're freezing. Surely she would have wanted them to keep people warm. Can't we use just one of them tonight?" Basil felt his blood turn to ice at the suggestion, but how could he explain to his new wife that he had made a deathbed promise to keep Mavis's quilts away from metal? How could he tell a practical modern woman that he believed his dead wife's needlework was somehow charged with supernatural power? Faced with Truly Jane's reasonable request and her obvious discomfort with the cold, Basil made a decision that would haunt him for the few remaining hours of his life. He went to the trunk and retrieved Mavis's masterpiece, the quilt with the blazing red center that had taken her 2 years to complete. The moment the quilt touched the metal bed frame, Basil knew he had made a terrible mistake. The air in the room seemed to thicken, and he could swear he heard a sound like distant thunder, though the night was clear and cloudless. The red flannel square in the center of the quilt began to glow with a light that had nothing to do with the oil lamp on their bedside table, and for just a moment, Basil thought he saw Mavis's face looking up at him from the fabric, her expression filled with a disappointment so profound it made his heart ache. But Truly Jane noticed none of this. She was delighted with the beautiful quilt, running her hands over the intricate stitching and marveling at the craftsmanship. "Your first wife certainly knew her needlework," she said as she settled under the quilt. "This is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen. It's almost like it's alive." If only she had known how true those words were, she might have lived to see another sunrise. They settled down to sleep, with Truly Jane curled contentedly under, Mavis's masterpiece and Basil lying awake beside her, unable to shake the feeling that he was betraying both women with this arrangement. Outside, the wind continued to howl through the valley, and Basil found himself listening for sounds that had no place in the natural world. The sound of Mavis's voice carried on the wind, calling out warnings that arrived too late to save anyone. It was just after midnight when the first flash of light filled the room. Truly Jane woke with a gasp, her eyes wide with terror, as she found herself surrounded by an electrical display that defied all natural law. The quilt was glowing, pulsing, with energy that seemed to come from within the fabric itself, and the red flannel center was blazing like a miniature sun. The metal bed frame had become a conductor, channeling power from some impossible source, and Truly Jane could feel electricity coursing through her body as she lay trapped beneath Mavis's masterpiece. She tried to scream, tried to throw off the quilt and escape from the bed, but the electrical charge had paralyzed her muscles, leaving her conscious but unable to move as the power built to a crescendo that would have been visible from miles away if anyone had been awake to witness it. Basil, lying beside her, was experiencing his own form of hell. He could see Mavis standing at the foot of the bed, her spirit more solid and real than it had any right to be, watching with satisfaction as her final promise was fulfilled. The explosion of light that followed could be seen as far away as Gatlinburg, a flash so brilliant that it turned night into day for several seconds before plunging the valley back into darkness. When the neighbors arrived at the S-Step cabin the next morning, drawn by reports of the strange light and worried about the family's welfare, they found a scene that would be seared into their memories for the rest of their lives. Basil's body was found in the center of the bed, or rather, what remained of it. He had been burned so completely that he was little more than charred bones and ash, consumed by a heat so intense that it had melted the metal bed frame into twisted, unrecognizable shapes. The wooden floor beneath the bed was burned through. To the crawl space below, creating a perfect circle of destruction that stopped precisely at the edges of where the quilt had lain. But here's what made the scene truly supernatural. Mavis's quilt was completely untouched. Not a single thread was singed, not a single stitch was damaged. The red flannel center still blazed with color, and the intricate pattern remained as perfect as the day Mavis had completed it. The quilt lay in the center of the destruction, like an island of preservation in a sea of devastation, somehow protected from the very force that had caused such complete annihilation around it. Truly, Jane had vanished entirely. There was no body, no remains, no trace that she had ever existed, except for the depression in the bed where she had been lying and a few scraps of her nightgown that had somehow escaped the destruction. The neighbors searched the cabin and the surrounding area, but they never found any sign of what had happened to Basil's second wife. Some believed she had been vaporized by the same force that had killed Basil, while others whispered that Mavis's spirit had dragged her rival into whatever realm of existence ghosts inhabit when they're not walking among the living. The most disturbing discovery came when the neighbors examined the quilt more closely. Sewn into the red flannel center, in stitches so fine they were almost invisible, were words that no one remembered seeing before. Death to those who break their promises to the dead. The letters seemed to shift and move when viewed directly, and more than one witness swore that they could hear Mavis's voice speaking the words aloud when they leaned close to examine the stitching. The local authorities, such as they were in that remote mountain community, ruled Basil's death an accident caused by a lightning strike, despite the clear night and the lack of any storm activity. But the mountain folk knew better. They understood that some promises transcend death, that some vows are written not just in the heart, but in the very fabric of reality itself. Mavis had spent 2 years stitching her supernatural vengeance into that quilt, creating a weapon that would wait patiently for the right moment to strike. The quilt itself became a source of both fascination and terror in Cades Cove. No one wanted to destroy something so beautiful, but no one dared to use it either. It was eventually sold to a traveling merchant who dealt in curiosities and oddities, a man who either didn't believe the stories about its deadly power or was confident that he could profit from its reputation. The merchant took the quilt to his shop in Gatlinburg, where it became known as the Cussing cover, a name that referred both to its supernatural nature and to the colorful language that anyone who encountered it seemed to develop. But the story of the Cussing cover didn't end with its sale. Over the decades that followed, the quilt would claim victim after victim, always following the same pattern. Someone would purchase it, drawn by its undeniable beauty and the dramatic story of its creation. They would take it home and use it on their bed, ignoring the warnings about its deadly history. And then, inevitably, someone would break the unspoken rules that governed the quilt's use. They would place it on a metal bed, or they would violate the memory of its creator in some other way, and Mavis's vengeance would strike again. The most well-documented case occurred in 1923, when a wealthy collector from Knoxville purchased the quilt for his antique collection. Despite being warned about its history, he displayed it on a metal bed in his guest room, thinking that the stories were merely mountain superstition designed to increase the quilt's value. He was found dead 3 days later, his body burned, beyond recognition, lying in a perfectly circular area of destruction, while the quilt remained untouched by the flames that had consumed everything around it. By the 1940s, the quilt had gained such a sinister reputation that antique dealers refused to handle it, and it disappeared from public view for several decades. But mountain folk have long memories, and the stories about the Cussing cover continue to be passed down from generation to generation. Every few years, someone would claim to have seen it in an estate sale, in an antique shop, in the home of someone who didn't know its history. And every few years, there would be another unexplained death, another case of someone found burned to death in circumstances that defied rational explanation. The Cherokee elders who still remember the old ways say that Mavis's spirit is trapped in that quilt, bound to it by the intensity of her love for Basil and her rage at his betrayal. They believe that she will never find peace until the quilt is destroyed. But they also warn that destroying it might release her spirit in ways that would be even more dangerous. According to Cherokee tradition, objects that have been charged with such powerful emotions become containers for the supernatural, and breaking that container could unleash forces that are beyond human control. So, somewhere out there, perhaps in an antique shop in the foothills of the Smokies, perhaps in the home of a collector who thinks they found a beautiful piece of Appalachian folk art, Mavis's masterpiece waits. The Cussing cover continues to exist, as beautiful and deadly as the day it claimed its first victims, ready to strike again at anyone foolish enough to ignore the warnings that have been written in blood and stitched in supernatural thread. The next time you see a quilt that seems too perfect, too beautiful, too intricately crafted to be the work of mortal hands, remember Mavis Estep and her final promise. Remember that some artwork is created not to bring comfort, but to deliver justice. And whatever you do, if you ever encounter a quilt with a blazing red center and stitching that seems to move in the corner of your eye, don't bring it home. Don't place it on your bed, and never, ever ignore the warnings of the dead, because in the mountains of Tennessee, some promises are kept forever, no matter how many innocent lives must be sacrificed to honor them. Tale 5. Atagahi, the Forbidden Healing Lake. Deep within the most remote wilderness of the Great Smoky Mountains, where ancient Cherokee hunting paths disappear into mist and shadows, there exists a place that appears on no modern map, a location so sacred and so dangerous that speaking its name aloud is said to invite catastrophe upon your entire bloodline. The Cherokee called it Atagahi, the Enchanted Lake, and for countless generations before white settlers ever set foot in these mountains, it served as nature's most closely guarded secret, a place where the laws of life and death bend to forces older than human civilization. What makes this story particularly terrifying is not just what happened to those who found this mystical place, but what continues to happen to anyone foolish enough to seek it out, because Atagahi is still there, still hidden, and still hungry for human souls who dare to violate its sacred boundaries. According to Cherokee tradition, Atagahi was created during the first days of the world, when the earth was still soft, and the boundary between the physical and spiritual realms was as thin as morning mist. The Great Spirit, in his infinite wisdom, designated certain places as sanctuaries, where the wounded creatures of the forest could come to heal their injuries and cure their diseases. Atagahi was the most powerful of these healing places, a lake whose violet-colored waters possessed the ability to cure any ailment, heal any wound, and even restore life to those who stood at death's very threshold. But this power came with an absolute condition. The lake was forbidden to human eyes, reserved exclusively for the animals who needed its magic to survive. The lake itself was said to be a thing of impossible beauty, hidden in a circular valley, surrounded by cliffs so steep and smooth that no human could climb them. The only way to reach Atagahi was through a series of hidden caves that twisted deep beneath the mountains, passages known only to the spirits who guarded the lake and the animals who had earned the right to seek its healing waters. The Cherokee described the lake as being perfectly round, its surface so still and clear that it reflected not just the sky above, but visions of the spirit world itself. The water was a deep violet color that seemed to glow with its own inner light, and around its shores grew plants and flowers that existed nowhere else on earth, healing herbs so powerful that a single leaf could cure ailments that baffled the greatest Cherokee medicine men. But the most wondrous aspect of Atagahi was what happened when injured animals arrived at its shores. Bears with infected wounds would wade into the violet waters and emerge completely healed. Their scars vanished, as if they had never existed. Birds with broken wings would drink from the lake and take flight immediately, their bones mended and their strength restored. Even animals that had been fatally injured, creatures that should have died from their wounds, would somehow drag themselves to Atagahi's shores and return to the forest whole and healthy. The lake was nature's own emergency room, a place where the normal rules of injury and death simply didn't apply. For centuries, the Cherokee honored the sacred prohibition against seeking out Atagahi. They understood that some gifts from the Great Spirit were not meant for human use, that the healing waters had been reserved for creatures who lived in harmony with the natural world without trying to control or exploit it. Cherokee hunters, who glimpsed the mist rising from the hidden valley, would turn away immediately, knowing that even an accidental sighting of the forbidden lake could bring terrible consequences. Medicine men would speak of Atagahi only in whispers, and only to pass down the warnings that kept their people safe from its supernatural guardians. But in the harsh winter of 1847, these ancient prohibitions would be tested by human desperation and the powerful love of a father for his dying child. Kanuna was a young Cherokee hunter, known throughout his village for his skill in tracking and his deep knowledge of the mountain wilderness. He was also a devoted father whose 5-year-old son, Sequoia, had fallen victim to a wasting disease that was slowly consuming the boy from within. Despite the efforts of the village's most powerful medicine men, despite every herb and ritual in their considerable arsenal, Sequoia continued to grow weaker with each passing day. As winter tightened its grip on the mountains and Sequoia's condition worsened, Kanuna found himself facing the most terrible choice any parent can imagine. He could watch his son die while honoring the ancient laws that had protected his people for generations, or he could violate the most sacred prohibition in Cherokee tradition and seek out the healing waters of Atagahi. The choice became inevitable when the medicine men finally admitted that they had exhausted all earthly remedies. If Sequoia was to live, it would require magic beyond their ability to provide. Kanuna's decision to seek Atagahi was not made lightly or selfishly. He understood that he was risking not just his own life, but potentially bringing disaster upon his entire village. Cherokee tradition taught that violations of sacred law could result in collective punishment, that the spirits might withdraw their protection from all the people, not just the individual transgressor. But as he watched his son struggling for each breath, Kanuna decided that some risks were worth taking, even if the consequences would haunt him forever. The journey to find Atagahi took Kanuna deep into parts of the Smoky Mountains that no Cherokee had explored for generations. Using fragments of ancient stories and half-remembered directions from legends passed down by the elders, he searched for weeks through treacherous terrain, following animal tracks that seemed to lead toward a destination that existed more in the spirit world than in physical reality. The deeper he went into the wilderness, the more the natural world seemed to resist his presence. Animals fled at his approach, plants withered when he touched them, and the very air grew thick and oppressive, as if the mountains themselves were warning him to turn back. It was during his 3rd week of searching, when Kanuna had begun to despair of ever finding the legendary lake, that he experienced what he would later describe as a moment of divine intervention. As he sat exhausted and hopeless beside a creek that seemed to lead nowhere, Kanuna began to pray with an intensity born of absolute desperation. He offered his own life to the Great Spirit in exchange for his son's healing, promised to accept any punishment if only Sequoia could be saved. And in that moment of complete surrender, the hidden passage revealed itself. What appeared to be solid stone suddenly shimmered and became translucent, revealing a cave entrance that had been invisible moments before. The opening was just large enough for a man to crawl through, and from its depths came a sound like distant singing, voices that seemed to be calling his name in languages that predated human speech. Kanuna understood that he was being invited to enter, that his desperate prayer had somehow earned him passage to the forbidden realm. But he also understood that this invitation came with no guarantee of safety. He was entering a place where human rules no longer applied, where the very concepts of life and death might be redefined without warning. The cave system that led to Atagahi was unlike anything Kanuna had ever experienced. The passages twisted and branched in ways that seemed to defy the laws of physics, sometimes leading upward when they should have led down, sometimes opening into vast chambers that were far too large to fit within the mountains that contained them. The walls were covered with paintings that moved and changed as he watched, depicting scenes of animals being healed at a mystical lake, but also showing the terrible fates that befell humans who violated the sacred boundaries. Some of these paintings showed Cherokee hunters being torn apart by spirit bears. Others depicted trespassers being dragged into the violet waters and transformed into creatures that were neither human nor animal. As Kanuna descended deeper into the cave system, he began to encounter the guardians of Atagahi, spirits that took the form of enormous animals with eyes that burned like stars, and voices that could speak directly into his mind. A massive bear, standing upright like a man but covered in fur that sparkled with an otherworldly light, blocked his path and demanded to know why a human dared to seek the forbidden lake. When Kanuna explained about his dying son, the bear spirit studied him for what felt like hours before stepping aside, but not without a warning that chilled Kanuna's blood. "You may pass, desperate father, but know that every step you take toward the lake binds you more tightly to a fate you cannot." Imagine, the healing waters exact a price that mortals are rarely willing to pay. The final chamber of the cave system opened onto a sight that struck Kanuna speechless with wonder and terror. Atagahi spread before him like a vision from the realm of the gods, its violet waters glowing with an inner light that made the entire hidden valley shimmer like a dream. The lake was perfectly circular, perhaps 100 yards across, surrounded by cliffs that rose straight up into a sky that seemed different from the one he had left behind. Deeper, more purple, filled with stars that moved in patterns that hurt his eyes to follow. Around the shores of the lake, animals of every description moved in peaceful harmony, creatures that should have been natural enemies drinking side by side from waters that healed every wound and cured every ailment. Kanuna watched in amazement as a deer with a massive wound in its side waded into the violet waters and emerged moments later completely whole. Its injury vanished without leaving so much as a scar. A hawk with a broken wing drank from the lake and immediately took flight, its bones mended and its strength restored. Most incredibly, an old bear that had clearly been dying, its fur gray and patchy, its movements slow and painful, entered the deepest part of the lake and emerged looking young and vital, transformed into the prime of life by the healing power of Atagahi's sacred waters. For several minutes, Kanuna simply stood at the edge of the hidden valley, overwhelmed by the beauty and power of what he was witnessing. The water was so clear and pure that he could see the bottom of the lake despite its considerable depth, and what he saw there made his heart pound with desperate hope. The lake bed was covered with objects that glowed with the same violet light as the water, healing stones, medicine plants, and artifacts of power that had been accumulating there since the beginning of time. If he could just fill a container with this miraculous water and bring it back to his dying son, Sequoia would be saved. But as Kanuna reached for the water bottle he had brought with him, every animal around the lake suddenly stopped what they were doing and turned to stare at him. The peaceful harmony of the scene shattered like glass, replaced by a tension so thick it was almost suffocating. The animals' eyes, which had been gentle and calm moments before, now burned with warning and barely contained rage. A massive elk, its antlers spanning wider than a man could reach, stepped forward and spoke in a voice that resonated through both air and spirit. "Human, you have been permitted to witness the healing of Atagahi, but you have not been granted permission to take from its waters. Leave now while mercy is still possible." Kanuna's heart broke as he realized the terrible choice he was being forced to make. He could honor the warning, leave Atagahi untouched, and return home to watch his son die. Or he could violate the sacred prohibition, take the healing water he desperately needed, and face whatever consequences the spirits deemed appropriate. As a father watching his child waste away, there was really no choice at all. Kanuna dropped to his knees beside the violet lake and began to fill his water bottle, his hands shaking with fear and determination as the healing waters flowed into the container. The reaction was immediate and terrifying. The moment Atagahi's sacred water touched the mundane material of Kanuna's bottle, the entire hidden valley erupted in supernatural chaos. The sky, which had been an otherworldly purple, turned blood red and began to spin like a whirlpool. The peaceful animals around the lake transformed into their spirit forms. Bears became giants with claws like spears. Deer grew antlers that could pierce the sky, and birds became winged shadows that blotted out the light. But most terrifying of all, the lake itself began to respond to the violation of its sacred nature. The violet waters, which had been calm and still as glass, began to churn and boil with a fury that seemed to shake the very foundations of the mountain. From the depths of Atagahi rose a figure that was both beautiful and terrifying, the spirit of the lake herself, a being of such power and majesty that looking directly at her was like staring into the sun. She was tall as a tree, with skin that shifted between human flesh and flowing water, hair that moved like waterfalls, and eyes that held the wisdom and wrath of centuries. When she spoke, her voice was like the sound of rushing rivers and crashing waves, a sound that penetrated not just the ears but the very soul. "Kanuna of the Cherokee," the lake spirit said, her voice echoing through dimensions that human minds were never meant to perceive. "You have stolen from the sacred waters, violated the ancient compact between spirit and flesh. This transgression cannot go unpunished, but your love for your dying child has moved the heart of the Great Spirit. Therefore, you will be offered a choice that will determine not just your fate, but the fate of all humans who might seek to exploit the gifts meant for innocent creatures." The choice the lake spirit offered was as terrible as it was simple. Kanuna could keep the healing water and save his son's life, but in doing so, he would become the eternal guardian of Atagahi, bound to protect the lake from future human trespassers by any means necessary. He would be transformed into something more than human but less than spirit, granted immortality and supernatural power, but forever separated from the mortal world he had known. He would save Sequoia's life, but he would never be able to hold his son again, never be able to watch him grow up, never be able to be the father he had fought so desperately to remain. Alternatively, Kanuna could pour the stolen water back into the lake, accept his son's death as the will of the Great Spirit, and return to his village to live out his natural life as a human being. The lake spirit would forgive his transgression and allow him to leave Atagahi unharmed. But Sequoia would die, and Kanuna would have to live with the knowledge that he had held his child's salvation in his hands and chosen to let it slip away. Standing in that supernatural valley with the stolen healing water in his hands and the spirits of Atagahi watching his every move, Kanuna made the decision that would transform him from a desperate father into something far more dangerous. He chose to save his son, accepting the terrible price that the lake spirit demanded. As the healing water touched his lips in a ritual that sealed his transformation, Kanuna felt his humanity drain away like water through sand, replaced by something ancient and implacable that cared more about protecting the sacred than about human feelings or desires. The journey back to his village was the last time Kanuna would walk among humans as one of their own. The healing water worked exactly as promised. Sequoia was cured immediately, his wasting disease vanishing like morning mist, his strength and vitality restored as if he had never been ill. But when the grateful village tried to celebrate Kanuna's success and learn the secret of his son's miraculous recovery, they found that their hero had become something they could no longer recognize. Kanuna's eyes now burned with an inhuman light, his voice carried harmonics that made listeners' bones ache, and his very presence seemed to distort reality in ways that frightened even the bravest warriors. Within days of his return, Kanuna began to change in ways that made his continued presence in the village impossible. His skin took on the violet hue of Atagahi's waters, his strength increased until he could uproot trees with his bare hands, and his ability to track became so supernatural that he could follow the spiritual essence of a person across vast distances. Most disturbing of all, he began to demonstrate knowledge of things that no mortal should know, the secret thoughts of his neighbors, the location of hidden objects, the exact moment when each person in the village would die. The Cherokee elders, recognizing the signs of spiritual transformation, understood that Kanuna was no longer truly one of them. With heavy hearts but clear purpose, they performed the ritual of separation, formally releasing him from his human obligations and acknowledging his new role as a guardian spirit. Kanuna accepted this decision without protest, knowing that his transformation was both necessary and irreversible. He gathered his few remaining possessions, kissed his sleeping son goodbye for the last time, and walked into the mountains to begin his eternal vigil as the protector of Atagahi. But this is where the story becomes truly terrifying for modern audiences, because Kanuna's watch did not end with his transformation. It intensified. As the decades passed and white settlers began to explore the deeper reaches of the Smoky Mountains, stories began to circulate about a figure that hunters and hikers encountered in the most remote areas of the wilderness. Descriptions varied, but certain details remained consistent. A tall, powerfully built man with skin that seemed to shift between human flesh and flowing water, eyes that glowed with violet light, and an aura of such primal power that wild animals would flee at his approach. These encounters followed a disturbing pattern. The figure, who came to be known among mountain folk as the Violet Man, would appear to travelers who seemed to be searching for something more than just a pleasant hike through the woods. He had an uncanny ability to sense when someone was seeking the legendary healing lake, whether they knew its true name or had simply heard rumors of a place where miraculous cures could be found. When the Violet Man encountered such seekers, he would offer them a choice that echoed the one he had been given centuries earlier: turn back immediately and live, or continue forward and face consequences that no human mind could fully comprehend. Most people who encountered the Violet Man were wise enough to heed his warning and abandon their search for Atagahi, but some, driven by desperation or greed or simple human stubbornness, chose to ignore his advice and press deeper into the wilderness. These individuals were never seen alive again, though their bodies were sometimes found weeks or months later, in circumstances that baffled investigators. The corpses were always discovered in impossible locations, at the bottom of cliff faces with no way to climb down, in the middle of raging rivers with no way to cross, or simply sitting peacefully in clearings where they appeared to have died without any sign of injury or struggle. The Cherokee who still live in the region understand that these deaths are not random accidents, but the result of violating the ancient prohibition against seeking Atagahi. They know that Kanuna, transformed into the eternal guardian of the healing lake, cannot allow humans to find and exploit the sacred waters. His love for his son compelled him to break the ancient law, but his transformation bound him to enforce that same law with supernatural vigilance. He has become the thing he once feared, a guardian spirit whose duty to protect the sacred overrides any human considerations of mercy or compassion. In recent decades, as the Great Smoky Mountains National Park has attracted increasing numbers of visitors, reports of encounters with the Violet Man have become more frequent and more disturbing. Park rangers receive regular accounts from hikers who claim to have been warned away from certain areas by a figure who matches Kanuna's description, though officially these reports are dismissed as encounters with normal park personnel or simply hallucinations brought on by exhaustion and altitude. But the rangers themselves know better. They've seen the missing person reports, studied the patterns of disappearances, and noticed that certain remote areas of the park seem to be protected by forces that go beyond normal wildlife or natural hazards. The most chilling modern accounts come from people who claim to have actually found Atagahi itself. These reports are rare and often dismissed as hoaxes or delusions, but they share enough specific details to suggest that some contemporary seekers have managed to penetrate the spiritual barriers that normally keep the healing lake hidden from human eyes. According to these accounts, the lake still exists in its hidden valley, still glows with violet light, and still serves as a sanctuary for injured animals from throughout the region. But these modern witnesses also report that Atagahi has become something far more dangerous than the peaceful healing sanctuary described in Cherokee tradition. The lake is now guarded by an entire army of spirits, not just Kanuna, but the souls of everyone who has died trying to reach the forbidden waters over the past 2 centuries. These guardian spirits have been transformed by their proximity to Atagahi's power into beings that are neither fully human nor completely animal, creatures that exist solely to prevent further violations of the sacred space. According to these terrifying modern accounts, anyone who manages to reach Atagahi now faces not just the choice between healing and transformation, but a gauntlet of supernatural challenges designed to test their worthiness and their intentions. The guardian spirits, led by Kanuna himself, subject potential violators to trials that probe not just their physical courage, but the deepest recesses of their souls. They force seekers to confront their true motivations, to admit whether they seek healing for genuine love or simply to satisfy their own selfish desires. Those who fail these trials are condemned to join the Eternal Guard, transformed into spirit, warriors whose only purpose is to protect the lake from future trespassers. But even those who pass the trials and prove their worthiness face a choice that has grown more terrible with each passing generation. The healing waters of Atagahi still possess their miraculous power, but the price for using them has increased exponentially as more and more humans have violated the sacred prohibition. Today, according to Cherokee elders who still remember the old stories, anyone who drinks from Atagahi's waters will indeed be healed of whatever ailment drove them to seek the forbidden lake, but they will also be bound to the lake forever. Added to Kanuna's army of guardian spirits, forced to spend eternity preventing others from making the same choice they made. The healing comes at the cost of everything that makes life worth living: human connection, the ability to love and be loved, the simple joy of existing as a mortal being in a mortal world. So the next time you're hiking deep in the Great Smoky Mountains and you hear stories of a hidden lake where miraculous healings can be found, remember Kanuna's choice and the price he paid for a father's love. Remember that some gifts are too dangerous for human hands, that some power comes with costs that can never be fully calculated until it's too late to turn back. And if you ever encounter a tall figure with violet-tinted skin and eyes that glow with otherworldly light, don't ignore his warning to turn back, because in these ancient mountains, where the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds is thinner than anywhere else on earth, the greatest tragedies are not those who seek forbidden knowledge and fail to find it, but those who find exactly what they're looking for and discover that some prices are too terrible for any human soul to pay. Atagahi is still out there, still hidden, still healing the innocent creatures of the forest while remaining forever beyond human reach. And Kanuna is still watching, still guarding, still paying the price for a father's desperate love that broke the oldest laws in the world. Tale 6. Lydia's Wedding Day Revenge. The Bride Who Never Dies. In the autumn of 1939, when the leaves of the Great Smoky Mountains blazed like fire against the darkening sky, and the first hint of winter's approach whispered through the ancient trees, the Greenbrier Lodge opened its doors to the wealthy and privileged who sought respite from the troubles of a world on the brink of war. The lodge was a testament to luxury and elegance, a sprawling mountain retreat where America's elite could escape the pressures of modern life and immerse themselves in the timeless beauty of the Tennessee wilderness. But what the guests and staff of the Greenbrier Lodge didn't know was that they were about to become unwilling participants in a love story so tragic and violent that it would transform their peaceful sanctuary into one of the most haunted places in all of Appalachia. Lydia May Whaley was 23 years old when she arrived at the Greenbrier Lodge in September of 1939, and she was without question the most beautiful woman anyone at the resort had ever seen. Tall and graceful, with alabaster skin that seemed to glow in the mountain sunlight, auburn hair that caught fire in the lamplight, and green eyes that held depths of intelligence and passion that could make strong men weak in the knees, Lydia possessed the kind of beauty that seemed almost supernatural in its perfection. She had come to the lodge with her wealthy family from Charleston, South Carolina, ostensibly for a month-long vacation before her wedding to Thomas Ashford III, the heir to a textile fortune and one of the most eligible bachelors in the South. But Lydia's month at the Greenbrier Lodge was not meant to be a simple vacation. It was intended as a final period of freedom before she entered into a marriage that had been arranged by her father for purely financial reasons. Thomas Ashford was 42 years old, nearly twice Lydia's age, with a reputation for cruelty and debauchery that was whispered about in the finest drawing rooms of Charleston society. He had already buried 2 wives under mysterious circumstances, and his interest in marrying Lydia had nothing to do with love, and everything to do with her family's shipping connections and her own considerable inheritance. Lydia's father, drowning in gambling debts and desperate to maintain his social standing, had essentially sold his daughter to Ashford in exchange for financial salvation, and no amount of pleading or tears from Lydia could change his mind. At the Greenbrier Lodge, however, Lydia met someone who would change the entire trajectory of her tragic story. His name was James Whitmore. He was 25 years old, devastatingly handsome, and working as a hunting guide for the lodge's wealthy guests. James came from a poor mountain family that had lived in the Smokies for generations, but he possessed an education and refinement that rivaled any gentleman Lydia had ever known. More importantly, he saw past her beauty to the intelligent, passionate woman beneath, and for the first time in her life, Lydia experienced what it meant to be truly loved for who she was rather than what she represented. Their romance began innocently enough, with James serving as Lydia's guide during her daily horseback rides through the mountain trails. But as the weeks passed, their relationship deepened into something that neither of them had expected or planned. They would meet in secret, stealing moments together in hidden clearings and abandoned cabins, sharing dreams and fears, and planning a future that seemed impossible given their vastly different social positions. James promised that he would find a way to earn enough money to support Lydia in the style she deserved, while Lydia swore that she would rather live in poverty with him than in luxury with Thomas Ashford. As September turned to October and Lydia's wedding date approached, their desperation grew more intense. They made increasingly reckless plans. They would elope to some distant state where Lydia's father couldn't find them. They would flee to Canada or Mexico. They would disappear into the mountains and live like hermits rather than be separated by a marriage that would destroy them both. But these were the desperate fantasies of two young people who didn't understand the ruthless power of money and social obligation. Lydia's father had too much invested in the marriage to allow his daughter to escape, and Thomas Ashford was not the kind of man who would tolerate being humiliated by a mountain guide and a rebellious bride. The wedding was scheduled for October 31st, 1939, Halloween, though the irony of that date would not become apparent until much later. The ceremony was to be held in the grand ballroom of the Greenbrier Lodge, followed by a reception that would showcase the union of two powerful Southern families. Lydia had tried everything to escape her fate. She had begged, pleaded, threatened, and even attempted to run away twice, only to be caught and brought back by her father's hired men. As the wedding date approached, she retreated into a state of numb despair, going through the motions of preparation while her spirit slowly died inside. On the morning of October 31st, Lydia stood in her bridal suite, wearing a wedding dress that had cost more than most people earned in a year, staring at her reflection in a mirror that seemed to show her not as a bride, but as a beautifully dressed corpse. The dress was a masterpiece of silk and lace, with a train so long it required 2 attendants to manage it, and a veil that had been handmade by nuns in a French convent. She looked absolutely stunning and absolutely miserable, like a princess from a fairy tale who had discovered that her prince was actually a monster. James had promised to meet her before the ceremony, to make one final attempt to convince her to run away with him. They had arranged to meet in the lodge's library at exactly noon, 1 hour before the wedding was scheduled to begin. Lydia had told him that this would be their last chance, that if they couldn't find the courage to flee together today, she would go through with the marriage and they would never see each other again. She had also made him promise that if she chose duty over love, he would leave the mountains immediately and never try to contact her again, because she knew that she wouldn't have the strength to resist him if he remained nearby. At 5 minutes before noon, Lydia left her bridal suite and made her way through the lodge's corridors toward the library, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and terror. She had made her decision. She would leave with James regardless of the consequences, abandoning her family and her fortune for the chance at true happiness. As she walked through the lodge in her wedding dress, guests and staff members stopped to stare at her ethereal beauty, not knowing that they were witnessing a bride's final journey toward either salvation or damnation. But when Lydia reached the library, she found it empty. She waited for 10 minutes, then 20, then 30, her hope slowly transforming into confusion and then into crushing despair. James never came. At 12:45, just 15 minutes before her wedding was scheduled to begin, Lydia finally accepted the terrible truth. The man she loved had abandoned her. Whether he had lost his nerve, been bought off by her father, or simply realized that he couldn't provide for her in the way she deserved, James had chosen not to fight for their love when it mattered most. What Lydia didn't know, what she would never learn during her brief remaining lifetime, was that James hadn't abandoned her by choice. Thomas Ashford, suspicious of his bride's behavior and determined to eliminate any potential interference with his plans, had discovered the lovers' final meeting and taken steps to ensure that it would never take place. James had been kidnapped the night before by men hired by Ashford, beaten unconscious, and transported to a remote cabin deep in the mountains where he was being held prisoner. By the time he managed to escape, Lydia would already be dead, and his failure to meet her would become a source of guilt that would drive him to madness and eventually to his own violent death. At exactly 1 p.m. on October 31st, 1939, Lydia May Whaley walked down the aisle of the Greenbrier Lodge's grand ballroom, wearing the most beautiful wedding dress anyone present had ever seen, and carrying a bouquet of white roses that trembled in her shaking hands. The assembled guests saw a radiant bride moving gracefully toward her future husband, but those who looked closely could see the tears streaming down her face and the expression of absolute despair in her green eyes. She was a woman attending her own funeral, going through the motions of a ceremony that would kill everything inside her that mattered. Thomas Ashford stood at the altar wearing a satisfied smirk that made several wedding guests uncomfortable, though none of them could have articulated exactly why. He looked like a man who had just won a particularly challenging game, someone who took pleasure not just in victory, but in his opponent's defeat. When Lydia reached the altar and took her place beside him, Ashford leaned close and whispered something in her ear that made her entire body stiffen with revulsion. Whatever he said, it was clearly not words of love or reassurance. The wedding ceremony proceeded with all the pomp and grandeur that money could buy, but there was an undercurrent of wrongness that made even the most oblivious guests feel uneasy. Lydia's responses to the minister's questions were barely audible, her voice breaking with each word she was forced to speak. When the time came for her to say, "I do," there was a moment of silence so profound that the entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if she would find the courage to refuse. But social pressure and years of conditioning proved stronger than love or self-preservation, and Lydia finally whispered the words that would seal her fate. The moment the minister pronounced them husband and wife, something inside Lydia shattered, so completely that several guests later swore they heard the sound of breaking glass, though no glass had been broken. Thomas Ashford leaned in to kiss his new bride, and the expression of triumph on his face was so ugly that it made children in the audience begin to cry. The kiss itself was brief but possessive, acclaiming rather than a celebration, and when it ended, Lydia's eyes had taken on a glassy, distant quality that made her look more like a beautiful doll than a living woman. The reception that followed was a lavish affair with dancing, drinking, and celebrations that continued well into the evening. But Lydia moved through it all like a ghost, smiling when spoken to, dancing when required, but clearly absent in every way that mattered. Those who tried to engage her in conversation found themselves talking to someone who was physically present but spiritually gone, as if her soul had simply departed her body the moment she became Mrs. Thomas Ashford. It was just before midnight when Lydia finally escaped the reception and made her way to the honeymoon suite that had been prepared for her and her new husband. Thomas was still downstairs drinking with his friends and boasting about his beautiful young wife, but Lydia knew that he would join her soon and that the nightmare of her wedding day would transition into the even greater nightmare of her married life. Standing alone in the honeymoon suite, still wearing her wedding dress but with her veil torn and her bouquet crushed, Lydia looked around at the romantic decorations and felt nothing but revulsion and despair. It was then that she noticed the rope. The honeymoon suite had been decorated with garlands and streamers, and among these decorations was a length of silk rope that had been used to tie back one of the curtains. As Lydia stared at the rope, an idea began to form in her mind, a way to escape from Thomas Ashford and her unbearable future that didn't require her to live with the consequences of her father's greed and her own cowardice. With a calmness that was more terrifying than any hysteria, Lydia untied the silk rope from the curtain and began to fashion it into a noose. She had never made a noose before, but her hands seemed to know what to do, as if some part of her had been planning this moment for much longer than she consciously realized. As she worked, she thought about James and wondered if he was thinking about her, if he regretted his decision to abandon her, if he would even care when he learned what she had done. Lydia dragged a chair to the center of the room, directly beneath the main ceiling beam, and climbed onto it while still wearing her wedding dress. The dress was so elaborate and heavy that it made her movements clumsy, but she managed to secure the rope to the beam and slip the noose around her neck. For a moment she hesitated, thinking about her family and the scandal her death would cause, thinking about the life she might have had if she had been braver, or if James had been stronger. Tale 7. Elkmont. Ghost Town. The Vanishing Community. In the heart of the Great Smoky Mountains, where ancient trees whisper secrets older than memory and morning mist clings to forgotten foundations like the breath of the dead, there exists a place that shouldn't be there, a community that was erased from existence but refuses to stay gone. Elkmont was once a thriving mountain town, home to hundreds of families who carved their lives from the wilderness and built a society that seemed destined to last forever. But when progress came calling in the form of government agents and park officials, the entire community was systematically dismantled, its residents scattered to the winds, and its very existence nearly erased from history. What makes Elkmont truly terrifying isn't just that it was destroyed, it's that it never really died. And every year, more evidence surfaces that the town and its vanished inhabitants are slowly, methodically, trying to come back. Elkmont began its life in the early 1900s as a logging community, one of dozens of such settlements scattered throughout the Smoky Mountains during the Great Timber Boom that would eventually strip millions of acres of ancient forest from the region. The town was built around the operations of the Little River Logging Company, which had purchased thousands of acres of pristine wilderness for the sole purpose of cutting down every tree large enough to be profitable. The company needed workers, and workers needed places to live, so Elkmont sprang up almost overnight in a valley that had been undisturbed wilderness just months before. But Elkmont was different from other logging camps. While most timber operations created temporary settlements that would be abandoned as soon as the local trees were exhausted, Elkmont was designed to be permanent. The logging company built substantial houses instead of temporary shacks, established schools and churches and general stores, and encouraged workers to bring their families and put down roots. By 1910, Elkmont had grown into a proper town with over 200 residents, complete with its own post office, railroad depot, and even a small hospital. The residents of Elkmont were a tight-knit community, bound together by the harsh realities of mountain life and the dangerous work of industrial logging. They were primarily families from the surrounding mountains, people whose ancestors had lived in these hills for generations, and who understood the rhythms and dangers of wilderness life. They built their homes from the same trees they cut for profit, raised gardens in clearings carved from ancient forest, and created a society that balanced the demands of industrial work with the traditional ways of mountain folk. But even as Elkmont thrived, its residents lived with an undercurrent of unease that no amount of prosperity could completely dispel. The mountain people had always understood that the land itself was alive, that the forests and streams and hidden valleys possessed a consciousness that predated human settlement by millennia. When the logging operations began destroying vast swaths of ancient forest, many Elkmont residents reported strange phenomena that suggested the land was responding to this assault with something approaching anger. Workers would describe feelings of being watched while they worked, of hearing voices calling from deep in the woods even when no one else was around. Tools would disappear overnight from secure storage areas, only to reappear days later in impossible locations, balanced on high tree branches, buried in stream beds, or arranged in patterns that suggested intelligence behind their placement. Most disturbing were the accidents that began to plague the logging operations with increasing frequency, equipment failures that shouldn't have been possible, trees that fell in directions that defied the laws of physics, and injuries that seemed to occur just when workers were thinking about quitting their jobs and leaving the mountains. By 1915, Elkmont had evolved beyond its origins as a simple logging camp. Wealthy visitors from Knoxville and beyond had discovered the cool mountain air and stunning scenery, leading to the construction of vacation homes and hunting lodges that transformed the town into a resort destination. The Wonderland Hotel was built to accommodate these wealthy guests, and Elkmont found itself serving two very different populations: the working-class families who had built the town, and the wealthy elite who came to experience the wilderness from the safety and comfort of well-appointed accommodations. This transformation created tensions within the community that would prove prophetic. The wealthy visitors saw Elkmont as a charming mountain retreat, a place to escape the pressures of modern life and commune with nature in comfort and style. But they also brought with them attitudes and expectations that were fundamentally at odds with the mountain way of life. They complained about the noise from logging operations, objected to the smoke from wood stoves and sawmills, and gradually began lobbying for changes that would make Elkmont more suitable for their refined tastes. The working families who had built Elkmont found themselves increasingly marginalized in their own community. Their children were discouraged from playing near the vacation homes. Their traditional practices were criticized as backward or unsanitary, and their very presence was seen as incompatible with the vision of Elkmont as an exclusive mountain resort. What had begun as a harmonious integration of different social classes gradually evolved into a quiet but persistent conflict over who had the right to define what Elkmont should be. The resolution of this conflict came not through compromise or negotiation, but through the sudden and devastating intervention of the federal government. In 1926, Congress authorized the creation of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, and Elkmont found itself directly in the path of this grand conservation project. The plan was breathtakingly simple and utterly devastating. The government would purchase all private land within the proposed park boundaries, remove all residents and structures, and return the entire area to its natural state. For the residents of Elkmont, this announcement was nothing short of apocalyptic. They were being told that their homes, their community, their entire way of life was incompatible with the government's vision of wilderness preservation. Families who had lived in these mountains for generations were informed that they would have to leave, that their houses would be demolished, and that the town they had built from nothing would be erased as if it had never existed. The wealthy vacation homeowners initially believed they would be exempt from this mass eviction. They had political connections, expensive lawyers, and enough money to fight the government's plans in court. Some were even granted long-term leases that would allow them to keep their properties for several decades. But the working families of Elkmont had no such resources or protections. They were given minimal compensation for their homes and businesses, forced to abandon possessions they couldn't carry, and scattered to distant towns and cities where they would live as refugees from their own mountains. The evacuation of Elkmont began in 1928 and continued sporadically through the 1930s as legal. Challenges delayed the final transfers of property. For the families being forced to leave, the process was heart-wrenching beyond description. These were people whose entire identities were tied to specific places: the hollows where their great-grandparents were buried, the streams where they had learned to fish as children, the forests where they had hunted and gathered for generations. They weren't just losing their homes, they were losing their connection to the land that had defined them as a people. Many residents reported experiencing supernatural phenomena during the evacuation process that suggested the land itself was responding to the destruction of the community. Houses that had stood solid for decades began developing structural problems overnight. Foundations would crack, roofs would leak, and walls would warp as if the buildings were aging years in a matter of days. Wells that had provided fresh water for decades suddenly went dry or turned brackish. Gardens that had flourished for years withered and died despite perfect growing conditions. More disturbing were the reports of temporal anomalies that began occurring throughout Elkmont as the evacuation progressed. Residents would describe walking familiar paths only to find themselves in parts of the forest they had never seen before, despite having lived in the area their entire lives. Children would claim to see other children playing in areas where no families lived, only to have these mysterious playmates vanish when adults tried to locate them. Most unsettling were the reports of people encountering their own neighbors and friends in parts of town that had already been evacuated, having conversations with people who had supposedly moved away weeks or months earlier. By 1940, the evacuation of Elkmont was essentially complete. The last permanent residents had been forced out, their homes demolished or abandoned to the elements. The Wonderland Hotel stood empty, its windows broken and its elegant furnishings left to rot. The school that had educated generations of mountain children was boarded up, its playground equipment rusting in silence. The post office was closed, the general store was shuttered, and the railroad depot that had connected Elkmont to the outside world was scheduled for demolition. The National Park Service's plan was to allow nature to reclaim the entire site, to let the forest grow back and eventually eliminate all traces of human habitation. Within a few decades, they projected, visitors to the area would never know that a thriving community had once existed in this wilderness valley. Elkmont would become a footnote in local history, remembered only by the scattered families who had been forced to abandon their mountain home. But the land had other plans. From the moment the last residents left Elkmont, park rangers and occasional visitors began reporting phenomena that suggested the abandoned town was not staying abandoned. The most common reports involved sounds: the laughter of children playing in areas where no children lived, the sound of sawmills operating where no equipment remained, the voices of people having conversations in houses that stood empty and roofless. These sounds were most frequently heard at dawn and dusk, during the transitional times when light and shadow played tricks with perception, but they were also reported during the middle of bright, clear days when there could be no question of auditory hallucinations. More disturbing were the visual phenomena that began occurring throughout the Elkmont area. Park rangers would report seeing smoke rising from chimneys in houses that had no roofs, lights shining from windows in buildings that had no electricity, and people moving around in yards where no people lived. When these sightings were investigated, rangers would find only empty foundations and overgrown lots, but the experiences were vivid enough and consistent enough that they couldn't be dismissed as simple imagination. The National Park Service initially tried to suppress these reports, fearing that stories of ghostly activity would attract unwanted attention from curiosity seekers and paranormal investigators. But as the decades passed and the reports continued to accumulate, it became impossible to ignore the fact that something genuinely strange was happening in the Elkmont area. Rangers who had worked in other parks for decades said they had never experienced anything comparable to the phenomena that occurred regularly around the abandoned town site. By the 1960s, the supernatural activity in Elkmont had evolved beyond simple sightings and sounds to include interactions that suggested the presence of intelligent entities. Park rangers would arrive at the Elkmont area to find that buildings scheduled for demolition had been mysteriously repaired overnight, broken windows replaced with new glass, collapsed roofs rebuilt with fresh lumber, foundations that had been cracking filled with new mortar. The materials used for these repairs were always historically accurate, matching the original construction methods and materials used by the town's builders in the early 1900s. More unsettling were the discoveries of personal belongings that shouldn't have existed. Park rangers would find children's toys in perfect condition despite decades of abandonment, family photographs that showed no signs of weather damage despite being left in the open, and household items that appeared to be brand new despite dating from the 1920s and 1930s. When these items were collected and cataloged, they would often disappear from secure storage facilities only to reappear in their original locations days or weeks later. The most significant development came in 1976 when the National Park Service made the controversial decision to preserve, rather than demolish, some of Elkmont's remaining structures. 19 buildings were saved as examples of Appalachian architecture and logging camp construction, creating an official ghost town that visitors could explore as part of their park experience. But this decision to preserve part of Elkmont's physical remains seemed to intensify rather than diminish the supernatural activity in the area. Visitors to the preserved Elkmont structures began reporting experiences that were far more intense and interactive than the simple sightings and sounds that had characterized earlier supernatural activity. Families would describe entering empty buildings only to find them furnished and inhabited, with phantom residents who would interact with visitors as if they were real, living people. These encounters were so vivid and convincing that many visitors didn't realize they were experiencing something supernatural until they left the building and found it empty and abandoned once again. Children seem particularly susceptible to these experiences, often playing with invisible friends in the Elkmont area and describing detailed conversations with other children who, according to their descriptions, perfectly matched actual residents of the historical town. Adult visitors would sometimes see these phantom children themselves, watching their own offspring playing elaborate games with partners who appeared solid and real until viewed from certain angles or in specific lighting conditions. The most disturbing reports involved families who claimed to have been invited into Elkmont homes by phantom residents and served meals with food that they could taste and smell but that didn't actually exist. These visitors would describe elaborate social interactions, conversations about local events, discussions of family news, shared meals that included locally grown vegetables and home-cooked mountain specialties. Only when they tried to leave would they realize that the houses were empty, the meals had never existed, and the friendly neighbors who had welcomed them were nothing more than memories given supernatural form. Modern paranormal investigators who have studied the Elkmont phenomenon believe they are witnessing what's known as a residual haunting, a situation where traumatic events have somehow imprinted themselves on the physical environment, creating a kind of supernatural recording that plays back under certain conditions. But the interactive nature of many Elkmont encounters suggests something more complex than a simple recording. The phantom residents seem to be aware of modern visitors, adapting their behavior and conversations to accommodate people from different time periods. Cherokee spiritual advisors who have consulted on the Elkmont situation offer a different interpretation. They believe that the forced removal of the town's residents created a spiritual wound in the land itself, a violation of the natural order that has prevented the souls of Elkmont from moving on to whatever comes after death. According to Cherokee tradition, people who are forcibly separated from their ancestral lands can become trapped between worlds, unable to find peace until they are reunited with the places that gave their lives meaning. The Cherokee also point out that the land around Elkmont was sacred long before the logging camp was established, and that the destruction of ancient forests and the subsequent erasure of human community created multiple layers of spiritual disturbance. They believe that the phantom town represents the land's attempt to heal itself by recreating the human community that once lived in harmony with the forest, but that this supernatural reconstruction is doomed to fail because it's based on memories rather than living reality. Recent developments in the Elkmont area have taken an even more disturbing turn. Park Service personnel report that the phantom town seems to be expanding beyond its original boundaries, with new structures appearing in areas where buildings never existed historically. These phantom constructions include modern amenities that the original Elkmont never possessed: paved roads, electrical lines, and even cellular phone towers that appear completely real until touched or photographed. Most alarming are reports from visitors who claim to have been recruited by phantom Elkmont residents to join their community permanently. These encounters typically involve lost hikers who are invited into phantom homes, offered food and shelter, and gradually encouraged to stay longer and longer until they begin to lose track of time and forget about their lives outside the mountains. Several missing person cases in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park have been linked to last known sightings in the Elkmont area, though no bodies have ever been recovered. The National Park Service has quietly implemented special protocols for the Elkmont area, including regular wellness checks for employees working in the region and strict limits on how long rangers can spend alone in the abandoned town. These measures were put in place after several incidents where park personnel became so psychologically invested in interactions with phantom residents that they had to be forcibly removed from the area and provided with psychological counseling. Local Cherokee advisors warn that the supernatural activity in Elkmont is likely to intensify rather than diminish over time, as the memories of the original town fade from living consciousness and the phantom community becomes the only version of Elkmont that continues to exist. They predict that eventually the phantom town may become so realistic and compelling that visitors will find it impossible to distinguish between the supernatural reconstruction and actual reality. The Cherokee also express concern that the Elkmont phenomenon may be spreading to other communities that were destroyed during the creation of the national park. They point to similar reports of phantom activity around the sites of other vanished towns and warn that the entire region may be becoming a kind of supernatural reconstruction zone where the past refuses to accept its erasure. So when you visit the Great Smoky Mountains National Park and find yourself exploring the preserved buildings of Elkmont, remember that you're not just walking through a historical site. You're entering a place where the boundary between past and present has been permanently damaged. The friendly voices you hear calling from empty buildings, the children you see playing in abandoned yards, the lights shining from windows that should be dark, these aren't just echoes of the past. They're evidence that some communities refuse to die, that some places are so deeply loved by the people who lived there that they continue to exist even after every trace of them has been erased from the official record. Elkmont is still there, still thriving, still welcoming visitors who might decide to stay longer than they originally planned. And every year, as more people forget that the town ever existed as a real place inhabited by real people, the phantom community becomes a little more solid, a little more convincing, and a little more dangerous for those who might mistake supernatural reconstruction for actual reality. The vanishing community never really vanished. It just learned to exist in ways that the living world isn't equipped to recognize or resist. Tale 8. The Brown Mountain Lights, Eternal Search, high above the rolling peaks of North Carolina, where the Great Smoky Mountains stretch into an endless horizon of mist-shrouded ridges. There exists a phenomenon so ancient and mysterious that it has defied explanation for over 2 centuries. The Brown Mountain Lights have been witnessed by thousands of people, scientists, skeptics, Cherokee elders, and terrified hikers who stumbled upon something that shouldn't exist in the rational world. But what makes these lights truly terrifying isn't their supernatural nature or their defiance of scientific explanation. It's the story behind their creation, a tale of love and loss so profound that it has literally torn a hole in the fabric of reality, creating a manifestation of grief so powerful that it continues to search the mountains every single night, 250 years after the tragedy that gave it birth. The year was 1771, and the Cherokee Nation was locked in a brutal war with the Catawba tribe over hunting rights and territorial boundaries in the mountains of what would later become North Carolina and Tennessee. This wasn't a conflict between strangers. The Cherokee and Catawba had been neighbors for generations, their territories overlapping in the rich hunting grounds around Brown Mountain. But as European colonization pressure mounted and traditional hunting areas became scarce, the two tribes found themselves competing for resources that had once been abundant enough to share. The war had been raging for 3 years when the Cherokee, War Chief Atagahi, made the decision that would create one of the most haunting supernatural phenomena in North American history. Rather than continue the grinding campaign of raids and counter-raids that was bleeding both tribes dry, he proposed a single, decisive battle that would settle the territorial dispute once and for all. The location he chose was Brown Mountain itself, a sacred site to both tribes, a place where the spirits of ancestors were said to gather and where the outcome of such a battle would carry the weight of divine judgment. The Catawba chief, Hagler, accepted the challenge, and messengers were sent throughout both tribes calling for warriors to gather, for what everyone understood would be the final confrontation. This wouldn't be a small skirmish between raiding parties. This would be a massive battle involving hundreds of warriors from both sides, a conflict so large and decisive that its outcome would be remembered for generations. The Cherokee gathered their finest fighters from villages throughout the Smoky Mountains, while the Catawba assembled a war party that included allies from several smaller tribes. But this battle would be unique in Cherokee history for another reason: the unprecedented number of women who accompanied the war party. Cherokee tradition typically kept women away from battlefields, but the wives, mothers, sisters, and daughters of the warriors understood that this conflict would determine the fate of their entire people. If their men were defeated, their families would face displacement, starvation, or worse. So they came, not to fight, but to bear witness, to provide spiritual support, and to ensure that if the worst happened, they would be there to carry out the sacred burial rites that would help their loved ones' souls find peace. The women established their own camp on a ridge overlooking Brown Mountain, far enough from the planned battle site to be safe from the fighting, but close enough to see what transpired. There were over 100 of them, young wives clutching babies, elderly mothers whose sons were fighting their first major battle, sisters who had never been separated from their brothers, and daughters who had begged to be allowed to accompany their fathers to war. They brought with them the sacred flames that would be needed for proper funeral rites, medicinal herbs for treating the wounded, and, most importantly, torches that would help them search for their loved ones when the battle was over. The battle began at dawn on October 13, 1771, and it was everything that both sides had expected, and far worse than anyone had feared. The Cherokee and Catawba warriors fought with a ferocity born of desperation, knowing that defeat meant not just personal death, but the potential destruction of their entire way of life. The fighting raged for hours, spreading across the slopes and valleys around Brown Mountain as tactical advantages shifted back and forth between the two forces. But what made this battle particularly horrific was its inconclusiveness. Unlike most Native American conflicts, which were typically decided quickly once one side gained a clear advantage, the Brown Mountain battle continued throughout the entire day without either side achieving victory. Warriors would gain ground, only to lose it again, charge forward only to be driven back, rally for what seemed like a decisive assault only to be repelled by equally determined defenders. As the sun began to set, both armies were exhausted, bloodied, and decimated, but neither had achieved the decisive victory they had sought. When darkness finally ended the fighting, the aftermath was catastrophic for both tribes. The battlefield was littered with the bodies of some of the finest warriors from both the Cherokee and Catawba nations. Entire bloodlines had been wiped out in a single day, and the survivors were too wounded and exhausted to continue fighting. The great battle that was supposed to settle the territorial dispute had instead destroyed much of both tribes' military capacity, leaving them vulnerable to other enemies and unable to effectively resist the encroaching European colonization. But for the Cherokee women watching from their ridge, the end of the battle was not a relief. It was the beginning of a nightmare that would consume the rest of their lives. As darkness fell across Brown Mountain, they could see the battlefield, stretching below them, covered with hundreds of bodies that were impossible to identify from a distance. Their husbands, sons, fathers, and brothers were somewhere among those fallen warriors, but there was no way to know who had survived and who had died without descending into that charnel house and searching through the carnage by torchlight. Cherokee tradition demanded that the bodies of fallen warriors be recovered and given proper burial rites within 24 hours of death, or their souls would be trapped between the world of the living and the realm of the ancestors. The women understood that they had to find their loved ones quickly, not just for their own peace of mind, but for the spiritual welfare of the entire tribe. If Cherokee warriors were left unburied on the battlefield, their restless spirits could bring disaster upon the entire nation. As the first stars appeared in the October sky, the Cherokee women took up their torches and began their descent toward the battlefield. They moved in small groups, calling out the names of their loved ones and praying to the spirits for guidance in their search. The torches cast dancing circles of light across the blood-soaked ground, illuminating scenes of devastation that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. Bodies lay twisted and broken, sometimes piled 3 deep where the fighting had been fiercest, often so mutilated by battle that identification was nearly impossible. The search continued throughout the night, with the women moving methodically across the battlefield, turning over bodies, checking faces, and calling out constantly in the hope that some of their loved ones might still be alive among the wounded. Some of the women found their husbands or sons quickly and were able to begin the sacred burial rites immediately. But others searched for hours without success, their torches growing dim as their supply of oil and pine pitch was exhausted, their voices growing hoarse from calling names that would never be answered again. As dawn approached, many of the women were forced to accept the terrible possibility that their loved ones' bodies might never be found. The battlefield was vast. The carnage was extensive, and some warriors had clearly been dragged away by wild animals or fallen into ravines where their bodies might remain hidden for months or years, but Cherokee spiritual tradition was absolute in its requirements. The search could not be abandoned while any possibility remained that a Cherokee warrior might be lying unburied among the dead. The tragedy of Brown Mountain deepened as the women realized that their one night of searching would not be sufficient. They would have to return the following night and the night after that, and every night thereafter until every Cherokee warrior had been accounted for. Some of the women had young children to care for and couldn't participate in the nightly searches, but they supported those who could by providing fresh torches, food, and medicine for the exhausted searchers. What began as a desperate attempt to recover the bodies of fallen warriors gradually evolved into something much more profound and disturbing. As weeks passed and the searches continued, the women began to report strange experiences that suggested their nightly vigils were attracting supernatural attention. They would see lights moving across the battlefield that weren't torches carried by other searchers, mysterious glowing orbs that seemed to move with purpose and intelligence, often leading the women to bodies they hadn't been able to find on their own. More disturbing were the voices the women began to hear during their searches, the voices of their dead loved ones calling out from the darkness, providing directions to their burial sites or simply offering reassurance that they were at peace. These voices were so clear and distinct that multiple women would often hear the same messages simultaneously, ruling out the possibility of individual hallucinations born of grief and exhaustion. As autumn turned to winter and the nightly searches continued, the Cherokee women began to understand that they were no longer searching for bodies that could realistically be recovered and buried. The battlefield had been scavenged by animals, scattered by weather, and gradually reclaimed by the forest. Any remains that might still exist would be skeletal fragments scattered across miles of mountainous terrain, but the spiritual obligation to search remained, and the women had become trapped in a cycle of grief and duty that they couldn't break. The first disappearances occurred in late November, when several of the searchers simply failed to return from their nightly vigil. Search parties sent to look for them found only their torches, still burning at spots scattered across Brown Mountain, with no sign of the women who had been carrying them. The missing women's families assumed they had become lost in the darkness and died of exposure, but their bodies were never found despite extensive searches. As winter deepened and more searchers vanished, the Cherokee elders began to understand that something supernatural was happening on Brown Mountain. The nightly searches had opened a doorway between the world of the living and the realm of the dead, allowing the spirits of the fallen warriors to manifest and interact with their grieving loved ones. But this supernatural contact came with a price. The women who participated in the searches were gradually being drawn across that threshold, joining their dead loved ones in whatever realm exists beyond physical death. By spring, all of the original searchers had vanished, leaving behind only their torches scattered across Brown Mountain and the mysterious lights that continued to appear every night. The Cherokee survivors understood that the women had made the ultimate sacrifice, choosing to continue their search in death rather than abandon their spiritual obligations in life. They had become ghost lights, supernatural manifestations of love and grief so powerful that they could exist independently of physical bodies. The Cherokee abandoned the Brown Mountain area after the tragedy, considering it a place where the boundary between life and death had been permanently damaged. But travelers through the region continue to report seeing mysterious lights moving across the mountain, always at night, always appearing to search for something that could never be found. Early European settlers describe seeing torches carried by figures that vanished when approached, and later witnesses reported glowing orbs that moved with obvious intelligence and purpose. By the early 1800s, the Brown Mountain Lights had become a well-documented phenomenon that attracted the attention of scientists and skeptics from across the region. Investigators proposed numerous explanations: swamp gas, reflected moonlight, atmospheric disturbances, even hallucinations caused by altitude and isolation. But none of these theories could account for the consistent behavior of the lights, their apparent intelligence, or their ability to interact with observers in ways that suggested conscious purpose. The lights continued to appear with remarkable consistency throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, becoming one of the most famous supernatural phenomena in the American South. Witnesses described seeing anywhere from a few lights to dozens of them, sometimes moving in formation, sometimes spreading out across the mountain in what appeared to be systematic search patterns. The lights would respond to human presence, often approaching observers before retreating as if curious about the living people who had come to witness their eternal vigil. Modern scientific investigations of the Brown Mountain Lights have employed increasingly sophisticated equipment and methodology, but have failed to provide a definitive explanation for the phenomenon. The lights have been photographed, filmed, and measured with electromagnetic sensors, confirming that they are real physical manifestations rather than optical illusions or psychological phenomena. But their behavior continues to defy scientific explanation, particularly their apparent ability to respond intelligently to human presence and their consistent appearance in the same location for over 2 centuries. Cherokee spiritual advisors who have studied the Brown Mountain phenomenon believe that the lights represent one of the most powerful examples of love transcending death in Native American tradition. They view the continuing searches as evidence that the bonds between Cherokee families are strong enough to survive physical death, and that the spiritual obligations created by those bonds can manifest as supernatural phenomena when the circumstances are extraordinary enough. But the Cherokee also warn that the Brown Mountain Lights represent a cautionary tale about the dangers of grief that refuses to accept loss. They believe that the women who became the lights were trapped by their inability to let go of their dead loved ones, choosing to continue a search that had become spiritually destructive rather than accepting the natural cycle of life and death. According to Cherokee tradition, this kind of obsessive grief can prevent souls from moving on to their proper place in the afterlife, creating supernatural manifestations that are ultimately harmful to both the living and the dead. Recent witnesses to the Brown Mountain Lights report that the phenomenon has evolved over the decades, with the lights appearing to respond to modern technology in ways that suggest they are aware of changes in the world around them. Hikers using flashlights report that the lights will often mimic their movements, while photographers have captured images showing the lights arranged in formations that seem to acknowledge the presence of cameras. Most disturbing are reports from visitors who claim the lights have communicated with them directly, using patterns of movement that spell out words or convey simple messages. The most chilling modern accounts come from Cherokee descendants who claim to recognize family members among the lights. These witnesses describe seeing orbs that move in ways characteristic of specific relatives, responding to family names or traditional Cherokee phrases in ways that suggest individual identity persisting within the supernatural manifestation. Some report feeling overwhelming compulsions to join the eternal search, to take up torches of their own, and become part of the phenomenon that has continued for over 2 centuries. Park rangers and local authorities have documented several cases of missing hikers whose last known location was Brown Mountain, though no connection to the lights has ever been officially acknowledged. These disappearances follow a consistent pattern. Experienced hikers with adequate equipment and emergency supplies simply vanish without a trace, leaving behind no evidence of their fate except occasionally their abandoned backpacks and camping gear arranged in neat piles that suggest deliberate placement rather than accidental loss. So when you find yourself in the mountains of North Carolina on a clear night, and you see mysterious lights moving across the distant peaks with obvious purpose and intelligence, remember the Cherokee women who chose love over life and duty over personal survival. Remember that some searches never end, that some grief is too powerful to be contained by the boundaries between life and death, and that some love burns so brightly it can literally light up the night sky for centuries. The Brown Mountain Lights are still there, still searching, still carrying their torches through an eternal night that began with a mother's need to find her son, a wife's determination to locate her husband, a sister's refusal to abandon her brother to an unmarked grave. They represent the most beautiful and terrible truth about human love, that it can transcend any boundary, survive any tragedy, and manifest in ways that defy every law of physics and logic. But they also serve as a warning about the price of love that refuses to accept loss, about the spiritual dangers of grief that becomes an obsession, and about the supernatural consequences of searching for things that are meant to remain lost. The lights continue to burn because the search continues, and the search continues because some hearts are too faithful to accept that their loved ones are truly gone forever. As we reach the end of our terrifying journey through the cursed mountains of Tennessee and North Carolina, I want you to take a moment and truly absorb what you've just witnessed. These aren't just stories I found in some dusty folklore book. These are documented accounts, verified legends, and ongoing supernatural phenomena that continue to claim victims in the Great Smoky Mountains to this very day. From Spearfinger's stone flesh and razor-sharp finger that still hunts children who wander alone, to the Brown Mountain Lights that represent an eternal search powered by love so intense it defied death itself, every single tale we've explored tonight proves that some places on this earth are fundamentally different, fundamentally dangerous, and fundamentally cursed. What should terrify you most isn't just the supernatural power of these ancient forces, but the fact that they're all still active, still hungry, and still waiting for the next unsuspecting victim to stumble into their domain. Millions of people visit the Great Smoky Mountains every year, and most of them have no idea that they're walking through a landscape where the laws of reality bend and break under the weight of centuries-old curses and supernatural vengeance. The park rangers know, the local Cherokee families know, and now you know, but that knowledge comes with a responsibility. If this video has opened your eyes to the hidden darkness that lurks beneath America's most beloved national park, then you need to be part of the Verified Fears family. Hit that subscribe button right now, because I risk everything to bring you the truth that others are too afraid to share. I spend sleepless nights researching these cases, traveling to these haunted locations and interviewing witnesses who still wake up screaming from what they've seen. This isn't just entertainment. This is real investigative work into phenomena that could save your life someday. But more importantly, I need you to share this video with everyone you know, especially anyone planning to visit the Smoky Mountains. Tag that friend who's always talking about their next hiking trip. Send this to your family members who think ghost stories are just harmless fun. And make sure everyone in your circle understands that some places in this world are genuinely dangerous in ways that go far beyond natural hazards. The more people who know these stories, the fewer victims these ancient curses can claim. In the comments below, tell me which tale terrified you the most, and more importantly, tell me if you've ever experienced anything supernatural in the Great Smoky Mountains. I read every single comment, and some of your stories have led to investigations that became full episodes. Your experiences matter, your encounters are valid, and your warnings could save someone else from becoming the next chapter in these ongoing horror stories. Remember, the mountains are beautiful, but they're also hungry. They're ancient, but they're also very much alive. And they're always watching, always waiting, and always ready to add new victims to their collection of supernatural tragedies. Stay safe out there, stay subscribed to Verified Fears, and never forget that some fears are verified for a very good reason, because they're absolutely terrifyingly real. The truth is out there, but it's up to you whether you're brave enough to face it.